Come on. Stay up. I guess that comes natural with age. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I want to welcome you all today to another episode of Old Tank Repair. For this episode, the candidate is going to be this 1990s vintage, second generation Tamiya German Jagdpanther tank destroyer. This is another one of my youthful builds, and it was built to basically my youthful standards. This model over here will be going through an extensive rebuild and redetailing format, which I'll be taking you, the viewer, along from start all the way to finish. And because of that, there is going to be a ton of content coming at you. This is undoubtedly going to be a really long video, so you might want to sit back, relax, enjoy. Maybe watch this video in segments if you don't have the time, or you can hit that little gear icon in the corner to speed it up. Regardless, sit back, enjoy, because there's going to be a bunch of info coming right at you, as well as a bunch of other tips and techniques in order to bring the model up to the condition that we have here. Before we get started, however, I just want to mention that this model here is built for my own personal collection. It's not for sale and or purchase. However, I often take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that info would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. And with that, let's go ahead and rewind to when this model was first started. Or I should say, when this rebuild was first started. And here's the model at the start of the rebuild. And no, do not adjust your computer screens or your phones. This is not a optical illusion. This is yet another Tamiya Jagdpanther that I went ahead and built when I was younger that is in dire need of a rebuild. As anyone is a fan of the OTR lineup, you'll know that I recently completed another OTR video on a Tamiya Jagdpanther, and that of course can be found on the video listings on the channel. But that version was the first generation Tamiya Jagdpanther that dated to the 1970s time frame. This one here was the second generation Tamiya Jagdpanther kit that came out in the mid-1990s time frame. The story of this model here isn't anything that's fancy with the backstory or anything like that. This one here I picked it up from my local hobby shop, and I want to say the year 1999 or 2000, around those whereabouts. So I was, basically 14, 15 years old, around there. And the model itself I picked up because at this time I was really starting to branch out and start acquiring many of the newer tooling Tamiya kits that were out there. Because at this time I basically burned through the majority of the old school Tamiya kits that were out there at the time. And those kits were, basically the affordable ones, and I pretty much filled up my collection of those builds, and I was looking to branch out and, to start exploring into what else was out there on the market. These kits obviously were very plentiful, and still are for that matter, and they were slightly more expensive, but, I saved up my pennies and I decided to buy this kit. And this kit here was fairly expensive for the time. I purchased this kit for anywhere between 35 to maybe 50 some odd US dollars, around there, and really the prices on these kits hover around that even till today, unless they're probably, I think, pushing towards the 60s depending where you find them. But regardless, at that time, specifically when you're just a 15-year-old kid, that is a lot of money, and specifically in the context of that era. So this model here was definitely one I was wanting to add to my collection, along with a few of the other more recent Tamiya releases that I did pick up at that time and may or may not be the subject matter of future OTR videos. But more on that, of course, is possibly to come. Outside of that, the model was a pretty uneventful build. We brought it home, and this was one of those things where I built over the weekend and after school. I believe I picked this one up in the late spring, maybe early summer, of that era. And the build itself went by fairly quickly. These Tamiya models, even the second generation ones, are fairly easily built and go together without really too much effort. The model itself is built basically out of the box. There are no extra things like photo etch that I added to it. I mean, back then, adding things like photo etch, woof, that's like, Rockefeller money. But the model itself goes together very well from what I remember. I did make some additions to the model, some of which are commonly seen on the other OTR videos, and if anyone has watched those, you'll probably know exactly what I'm talking about, and they are something that I'm probably going to have to fix, specifically once I take the paint off and I see exactly how extensive that is. But you'll see that in more depth as I review the model in its current condition. So on that note, let's go ahead and take a look at the model in its current configuration. The model itself, like I stated before, is built completely out of the box. I did build it with Testor's red tube model glue, which was, the technique that I was using back then, which is good in a way because if you're doing a rebuild like this, the parts are just going to crumble off of it, which is great because it allows me to strip the paint off, clean them up, and reinstall them without any sort of collateral damage. But if you are watching this and you have no intention on ever rebuilding your model, do not use Testor's red tube model glue. This stuff is terrible. It's a low-end product, and it's basically for noobs, the best way to put it. On my builds, I personally like to use super glue to adhere everything to the surface, and it works far better than the red tube glue would ever work. So that's just my typical warning PSA that I generally mention in these videos. Do not use Testor's red tube glue, which you will see once the rebuild starts, exactly how these pieces all start crumbling off. Specifically, since this model here is old enough to buy alcohol, yeah, the Testor's red tube definitely is known not to age very well, and the models will start disassembling on you. But again, that may or may not be a positive. As for the build itself, I don't remember there being any problems with parts getting lost or anything along those lines. Looking at the back here, generally on these Panthers, I would always have a problem with the small little hooks. These were always something that were probably one of the more challenging aspects of a Panther build, where these little hooks are really small, they're hard to clip off, hard to properly clean, and even harder to glue on, specifically when you're younger and you don't really have the techniques down pat at that point. And even today, as I often mention in my Panther videos and King Tiger videos, these parts here are just prone to fling off the Lost Partia. So, even today you have to pay attention to this area. But fortunately, teenager John was able to assemble these pretty well. One thing I can see is that I went ahead and did the technique that my father and I did quite a bit back then, where we added meshwork, but instead of adding it to the outside, which is where it would be on a real Panther, I went ahead and added it to the inside for one reason or another. This is something that I'm definitely going to revisit on this build and take care of that promptly once the paint is stripped off. The mesh itself is just fiberglass window mesh, you buy in a roll, and this was the stuff that was used back then quite often. But yeah, that's something that has been seen on other OTR videos and also has been removed in other OTR videos. Carrying on further, the spare tracks seem to be mounted in the racks just fine. The tools look okay. There is one tool missing, but I think I mounted it or put it on the inside here. This is just, again, the model just aging on the shelf, and old glue being what it is, the piece popped off. I was smart enough to put it on the inside in case, save for a later date if I ever just wanted to glue it back on, or if I was going to rebuild the model outright, which is why we're here today. The jack block. One thing that I wanted to play around with was to mimic the jack block being made out of wood, but being overpainted with the base coat and the camouflage, which is why you can see it in this configuration here. But I added some type of a wash to it in order to lighten it up to make it look like it's the wood but aging with the paint on the surface. That was actually a pretty interesting technique that I tried back then. It showed me trying to think outside the box a little bit. I don't know. We'll see whether or not I'll continue to do that on this build, maybe as like a nostalgic type, hat tip, but we'll see how that pans out as the video goes on. The remainder of the tools, just standard out of the box Tamiya. One thing that I did know how to do back then was I understood the concept of painting the tool post the colors of the, camouflage. This is obviously something I still do today. And, it was something that I pretty much pioneered on my builds back then. So, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Moving along, the MG34T is in good shape. The mantlet is all stock, as is the main tube. The mantlet, I like the way it was able to position on this one, where you had full rotating motion. This was a huge improvement over the old school Tamiya one that I mentioned in the other video. The barrel itself is, of course, a two-piece assembly, and it seems like I did the bodywork on the two barrel halves. Came out okay. I see a very faint line in some areas, but we'll see how that looks once the paint's stripped off. A lot of times it looks like it's okay, then I strip the paint off and yeah, you can see like a massive glue or putty smear on these areas over here. So that is definitely something that I'm going to be paying attention to. I can see some of the lines that are integrally molded in for the shroud over here. These are puttied over on the top and bottom portions. This is something that I'm definitely going to be revising once I actually dig into this. Also on this area over here, you can see some of the other modifications that I made, which is the addition of some added weld bead and torch cut lines. This was added with the Dremel, and I have done this on a few other builds found on the OTR lineup. This was a bit of detailing I was doing at the time, and sometimes they came out better than others. This one here, they don't look too bad, to be fair, but this is something that I'll probably be cleaning up once the build continues, and we'll see how that pans out as the model progresses. The Bosch light looks to be pretty good. The bottom of the hull also looks pretty good too. I'm not seeing any real egregious problems down here. The suspension looks like it was properly assembled. The swing arms aren't all over the place, which was something that I've seen on a few of my other older builds, like the JS3 for instance. The tools, again, look pretty good, and this model is actually in fairly decent shape. The reason why I kind of jumped on this one here was actually when I was working on the two Italeri Jagdpanthers that I did the double feature video on, which is another video on this channel. I used this one here as a reference on some of the details that were a little vague on the Italeri instructions, namely the hatches. As I touched in that video, I kind of made a mistake when I first assembled it, and I had to debond it and repair that. And this was the model here that was used to correct that. At that time, when I saw the model, I said to myself, yeah, I think, at some point I should give this one a proper rebuild, and that's why it's sitting here on the table. The model itself, as a side note, was sitting in my shelf. I built the model, like I stated before, and once it was done, it just sat in my display case with the other models that I've shown on this channel in the past, and it sat there literally ever since. So we're looking at about 20-something years of dust sitting on the surface. And as I've touched upon in a few other videos, this model here was stored in a glass-covered bookshelf. I've mentioned this in a few videos, but I want to keep bringing it up for good reason. Those cabinets are an illusion where you think, hey, look, it has a door that covers the front. This is going to be fantastic to store models in, and actually it's nothing that couldn't be any farther from the truth. Those cabinets are actually pretty bad. First, they're kind of small, and you can only fit so many models on one shelf. Even if you have a wooden second floor added to the bin, you're still limited to what you can put on the inside. The second thing that's the biggest problem with those shelves is dust. They are not dust proof. Yes, granted, you don't get the big fluffy dust that you see on other models that are just left outside on in the room with on a shelf. However, you get that fine silty dust like you could see on this build here, where this dust is actually really hard to get rid of. Even if you dunk it in water, it just doesn't go away. And even worse, if you try to wash it off, it'll actually turn into like a weathering wash, and it'll just pool up in areas like weld beads and things like that, and it doesn't really help. It might sound cool, like, oh, look, I could weather it. No, it actually does the adverse. It's terrible. So that's the other thing I want to mention. As I always mention in these videos, the best, in my opinion, solution to solve the storage or dustproof your models is to get those clear plastic boxes from Hobby Lobby or something similar to that. Those boxes are excellent because they basically seal off the model completely from the environment, and these models do not get any sort of dust on them whatsoever. I've had models in them for about 10 years now, and they are as dust-proof as the day I put them in there. So that's the way I store my models, and that's the way I recommend people to do so. The only caveat is that if you have a model like this with rubber tracks, you want to have some kind of paper laid down on the surface, because the rubber tracks making contact with that clear plastic will actually have a negative chemical reaction, and the plastic will actually start eating and sticking to the tracks. That is definitely something that you don't want to have to happen to your build. The best way to elude that is to just put a piece of white paper down, and that barrier is more than suffice at separating the two materials, and it keeps the models preserved for years on end. So with that quick side tangent out of the way, back to the model at hand. You can see here again, the model is actually, in fairly good condition. I remember having to assemble these exhaust manifolds, and I like this version here with the 2 duct sections. It was pretty interesting. I believe on the real Jagdpanther there would be mesh in these locations here, but this is something I have to brush up on, and it's been a little while since I looked at a Jagdpanther. The top engine deck I already mentioned. This model does have a functional rear hatch, which handle I literally just broke right now, so that's something I'm going to have to revise. But you can see that the hatch opens up, and you do have some rudimentary interior detailing here, with some shelves and bulkheads and things along those lines. I spray painted the inside of the model white, or flat white, which is something that I did on models back then. This is something that is not going to be budged at all, because remember, once the model gets dunked in denatured alcohol, the acrylics are going to go, but the spray paint remains. It doesn't get dislodged by that, but it's on the inside here, so it's not a problem. The biggest problem with the barrel is actually the droop. Like I mentioned before, this is something I am going to be addressing, and we'll see exactly how as the video goes on. Outside of that, the model was painted with, before I want to talk about the suspension. The wheels are not glued on and are just placed in these locations, and the track goes over it. This was so that I could actually play with the model. This was something that I actually wanted to build into my builds at this period of time. The concept of gluing wheels on a Tamiya model specifically was just, unfathomable. So at the time, I didn't do that. I just basically put them in place, and they just hold themselves in place because of the interwoven design. The model here has its side skirts glued in place, and because of that, like I said before, the tracks were not glued to the top portion of the wheels. This is something that I may or may not keep. We'll see how that pans out as the build goes on. Because obviously, if you have the side skirts in place, you're not going to see the track with its sag, so, you might as well just leave it that way. But again, we'll touch upon that later. As for the paintwork, I painted it all with exterior latex. This was a technique that I even knew back then. The only difference between now and then, though, and this was something I didn't quite figure out at the time, was there was no primer used on the surface here, so it's just exterior latex applied on with a single action airbrush in a few layers, and finally it dried enough to a point where the opacity was there. It's for a base coat. This is definitely a technique that I sort of still use with the the type of paints and with the application. However, nowadays the model is thoroughly primed with a spray paint just so that the latex has a better surface to stick to. This paint here will definitely come off without any problems once it takes the dunk. As for the paints themselves, like I stated before, they were applied via a single action airbrush, and that's really the biggest crux of the rebuild. I kind of like the way the model came out, believe it or not. I kind of like the colors. I kind of like the weathering black wash that I added to it at that time. And I kind of like the partial ambush. I was trying to, again, think outside the box here, but what kills it for me is just that single action airbrush, and this is why I don't use single action airbrushes. I'm a double action airbrush guy. With a double action airbrush, you just have so much more control over the paint flow and the airflow that a single action just can't compare. Pretty sure I'm going to be lit up in the comment section and people tell me, oh, I like single action airbrush. That's great. If it works for you, that's awesome. But, I think the resume of my work speaks for itself. I prefer a double action, and that's just the way I like to build my models, and this one here will be painted with a double action airbrush. And that's basically all there is to the outside. Like I stated before, this build here was fairly, simple. The decals, of course, are the Kit Supply water slide decals. They went on. I did not have any varnishes or anything at the time. I don't even think they're dull coated in place. I think that they're just held on with just the decal itself. And I believe I washed it over with some of a watered down black wash to dull them out a little bit, which had some success. Not really. Decals have always been something that's been a little tricky, but fortunately I do have quite a few water slide decals on hand. These are not going to survive the rebuild process. They're going to be sacrificed to the OTR gods, and more than likely the tank will be remarked with some other type of markings. So that's really all there is to it. Now, I've said this on a few other OTR builds. I'm not expecting this one to be too in-depth, but then again, I always end up getting surprised by one thing or another leading to something else.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
So we'll see how that pans out as this build gets commenced. So with that, let's go ahead, teleport over to the shop where this thing is going to be ready to take the dunk. Alright, so with the model back in the shop, it's time to start disassembling the detail components. Unlike the other OTR builds where the pieces are preemptively falling off prior to even me getting it into the shop. This one here, the model is in better condition. So we're going to go ahead and quickly go through the disassembly process. Fortunately, red tube being red tube, the parts just pop right off. First thing I'm going to start with is the side skirts right here. Came off without any issues, and you get to see what it looks like on the inside. As I touched upon before, this one here, I did not glue the top portions of the track to the wheels as you're supposed to do, but again, once the side skirts go on, you don't see or appreciate any of that. So it also appears that at some point I said screw it on this side with the side skirt mounts, as only one is present. And I came to the conclusion that, well, it's going to get covered up anyway, so screw it. But this is something that I may or may not be changing, so see how that pans out. Okay, with the side skirts off, let me go ahead and carefully move the remainder of the tools. Okay, tow cables came off without any issues. For the main tools, well, I guess I could start with the track. These I'm probably not going to salvage because I literally have tons of individual Lincoln Light tracks on hand for Panthers. So after a minute or so with the little box cutter blade, I was able to extract the majority of the little frail detail parts that are kind of loose. This would include the majority of the Pioneer tools, the bow MG34T barrel, as well as the spare tracks. Spare tracks came off better than others. Some of them were okay, others gave me a little bit of a fight. I cracked one little section off right over here. This is something that I'm obviously going to have to deal with as the build goes on, but here goes that little portion here of the track. Hopefully I'll be able to extract that to do the repair. If not, I may have some of these pieces in my spare bin, so we'll see how that pans out. Also removed at this time are the tracks, and I'm in the process of removing the wheels. Tracks came right off. They were not glued on, of course, and neither were the road wheels, so they just popped off in unison, just like they did on the other Jagdpanther video OTR build that I mentioned earlier. Also, at this point, I just want to mention this is why you don't paint your tanks, no matter what type of tank it is, but specifically German World War II tanks, with the wheels on. As you can see, you will miss locations where the wheels are in place. It's impossible to get these things painted in this format. And even here on the back portion of the wheels, you can see how the paint is just very thin, if not non-existent, on certain key locations. So don't be a fool. Paint the parts before you install them to your model. It's just mind-blowing how I see YouTubers out there who do models, and prominent ones specifically, and they don't do that. It's just it just blows my mind. Anyway, so back to the wheel extraction. They just simply pull off in this type of a manner. Kind of have to pull them all off in unison. Installation is going to be similar along those lines as I touched upon in the other Jagdpanther videos I just mentioned. So once they all come to a certain point, they just pop right off. And there you can see the road wheel with the bare plastic showing through. In addition to the bare plastic showing through, don't ask me how you're supposed to paint these tires once they're glued in place. It's just, yeah, don't do that. Paint them and then install. Don't build then paint. With the suspension off, the model at this point is going to be prepped now to take its dunk. To do that, I need to weigh it down because, as I frequently mention in these videos, plastic models tend to want to float, and if you're doing a denatured alcohol bath, you really want the thing submerged so the denatured alcohol has all the opportunity to have at the paint on the surface to dislodge it, and it'll make the paint stripping process go by much easier. Unlike the other Jagdpanther, where the upper and lower hulls were able to come apart, this one here, at the moment, that's not the case. So the only entry point is right here with the large shell ejection port hatch. So let me find some bits of hardware to stuff in there to give it mass. So we got some brass shell casings, we got some bits of hardware. No, that looks like it's just going to hang up. Nail would work. lump of brass, and a, not sure if, yeah, screw it, I'll try that, see how that works. Alright, that should be suffice to keep the thing down. And the next thing I want to do is with the small parts that we have here, obviously these cannot get lost during the denatured alcohol bath. In the past, I used this little bell assembly over here for these parts, but as I touched upon in the other, or in the last OTR video, I finally got around to buying one of those little jeweler's baskets that we have right here. These things are awesome. I always wanted to get one, and now I finally got around to doing it. Thank you, Amazon Prime Day. The piece itself you can find, again, on Amazon with the link listed below in the video description. These are fantastic for this type of work here, for, you know, small little fragile components like tools and other little pieces of suspension. Obviously, they're not going to get lost in this mesh type housing. So the way it works, it's this little spring clip type thing, and you just open it up, load it up with all of the various components, and once it's all set, you can close it up, and the pieces are not going to go anywhere. Now, as for the wheels, these are obviously going to need to be stripped, but there's no way there's enough space in this little sphere over here. That's probably the biggest complaint I have for this device, is that it's awesome, but it's a bit on the small side. But for the wheels, I could still use the large, or the little cup mechanism that I fabricated in an earlier video. And with the size of the wheels, they're obviously not going to fall out between those little holes that we have there. So, will it even be big enough? Let's find out. Looks like I'm going to need another cup. Well, it's stuffed to the gill, but it should be more than suffice for the job at hand. Alright, so the one bit of equipment that are not going to get the denatured alcohol bath are the tow cables, because these are just spray painted flat black. There's no point getting these into the denatured alcohol. Maybe I'll do it anyway just to de-dust the surfaces, because they do have that fine silt dust on them. Of course, with the tank all broken down to its sub-assemblies, it's now time for everyone's favorite cast member in the OTR lineup, and that is the bucket of denatured alcohol. As you can see, the layer of silt on the bottom is growing ever more after each of these videos for obvious reasons, and we're going to go ahead and make that layer a little bit thicker momentarily. However, before the model can actually take the plunge, it's time for everyone's favorite, yours and mine, court-ordered safety briefing. Denatured alcohol is a pretty serious substance. You don't want to mess around with it. You know, I am wearing gloves. You don't want to get it on your skin. You don't want to inhale the fumes, so use it in a well-ventilated area. You also don't want to get in your eyes, so you might want to wear safety eye protection. And most importantly, do not drink the stuff. Don't be a horse's ass, and don't be an idiot. The two words can probably be used interchangeably on that case. You also absolutely do not want to smoke around this stuff. It is highly combustible. I mean, smoking cigarettes in general is pretty gross, but even more so around denatured alcohol, that's definitely something that's going to lead for some really bad results. So use your head, use cautiously, and you should be all right. Okay, here we go. Take one last good look at this build before she takes the plunge. Dropping it in 3, 2, 1, and there she blows. Alright, so this one's a little bit tricky because the barrel is not broken like it was on the other OTR example, so that's going to add a little bit of a complication to it. Side skirts, I don't know if I'm going to strip them, honestly. I'll leave them out for now. Here goes the track. Now, the track, like I stated before, are painted with acrylics, or I should say exterior latex, so these should strip. So, we're going to see how that pans out. Usually I tie a little wire around them, but I think we'll be okay in this case. Tow cables are not going to strip off, but there is a layer of dust on them, which the alcohol should clean off. Time for the wheels to take the plunge. and the small little basket of parts. Okay, so like I stated before, this one's going to be a little weird. I'm not going to be able to seal it up entirely because of the barrel, and I'm probably going to have to go ahead and flip it. But before that happens, I am going to top it off with some more alcohol. Because I can see the front glass's plate there is still sticking up over the surface. Looks like I got to get some more of this stuff too. Alright, that's the whole can. Looks like I need to add something on my shopping list. So the model's literally been in here for about 60 seconds, and I can already see the surface starting to brittle up. If I zoom in here with the camera, hopefully this comes out on screen, but yeah, you can really see how much of an effect the denatured alcohol is having on the surface of the model at this early stage. So I'm going to leave it in here for probably about 6, 7, maybe 8 hours. I think it's really going to be accelerated over the past OTRs. Like I stated before, this one here is painted with exterior latex, not just standard Tamiya acrylic, so the paint is definitely going to be affected in a quicker manner. But as I usually state in these videos, the longer you leave the model in the solution, the better the paint stripping process will go. So as you can see, the alcohol is really doing a number on the paint right now, but I really need to continue with the remainder of my day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to gently top the bucket off, and I'm going to place it in a really secure portion of the shop. This is more important with this build as opposed to the other ones because obviously the lid is just on without any sort of, attachment points, and this is something that is just beckoning to be kicked by someone in the shop. So I'm going to go ahead and really take care of this, and I'll get back to you guys probably in a number of hours, maybe a day or so, until I'm actually ready to start digging into the surface with the brush. Okay, so it's been about 8 or so hours since the previous scene, and I think I can start with the paint stripping process, or at least start it for the majority of the hull itself. As you can probably see if I zoom in, the cracking has gotten even worse since before, and you can see like in this area here, the paint is basically just peeling off in one giant layer. So I'm pretty confident that the brush here should be able to do the job just fine. So this leaves me to just put on my respirator because it usually stinks up the shop with fumes, and like I stated before, you don't want to breathe these in. And once the respirator is on, I can go ahead and start with the stripping. So let's go ahead, throw on some nifty copyright-free soundtrack, and start with the fast frame rate of me cleaning the surfaces up. So after a pretty quick paint stripping process, here go all the components here on the table. During the stripping process, as we saw before, the glues gave way on the upper and lower hull sections, which is actually something that's really good because this is going to streamline the rebuild quite a bit and allow me to correct some certain mistakes that I may have made when I was younger. As for collateral damage, well, there's really not that much going on with this one. Some of the pieces did break off during the strip, and this would include things like the little U-shackle hooks over here. These never seem to survive the stripping process for one reason or another, and frankly they're easily broken during just standard building, but I'll probably make a mold of it just so I could flesh it out. We'll see how that pans out. As for some of the other things to mention, on the sprockets over here, one of the sprockets, and I forgot to mention this earlier, was repaired. Apparently during the original build I might have cracked or cut or did something to this tooth over here, which, as you can see, damaged the piece quite a bit. I did glue the part back on, and for all intents and purposes, it looked like it was able to do the job just fine. However, I'm on the fence if I'm going to keep this and use it on this rebuild at this time. You see, at the time I'm building this one, I'm actually building a fresh Jagdpanther build, and with the way circumstances on that build came out, I have an extra runner of suspension parts, and one of the parts include a brand new sprocket. So there's no point letting that sprocket sit in the spare bin, and I might as well go ahead and use it on this particular build. So that's probably what I'm going to do. As for this one here, if that other sprocket was not in my possession, I could easily polish this one up. This one's not too far gone. The back fasteners over here are pretty much obliterated. However, fortunately, that's on the rear section of the sprocket. It's not really that relevant. And the only thing to mention is only on this area over here, there's a little bit of some remnants and shards of where the repair was done. This could easily be polished away with some sandpaper or needle file, but again, there's really no point to polish this one up because I have a good replacement on hand. So just wanted to get that out of the way. The other thing that I did at this time was I broke one of the grills that are found in this section over here. The grill, when I first built the model, had this mesh, this fiberglass mesh stuff inserted in place like I may have touched upon before, and obviously these are going to be replaced quite promptly. Well, to remove the one piece, I tried to remove the grills like hanging on. However, it didn't survive the removal process and the grill was pretty much destroyed. So again, fortunately I have the other build on hand. I'm going to make a mold of this component here and cast a fresh one in resin, which will look identical to the plastic one once everything is said and done. As for the other grills, I am of course going to yank out the meshwork, and I'll probably show how I do that on camera. I could just fish it out if is from the looks of it, but we'll see how that turns out during the actual build itself. One positive thing to point out, specifically now that the paint is off, is that the surface is completely unmessed with. And as I touched upon before, this is a huge plus because back in the day, I would do that dumb cast texturing thing with the Dremel nicking up the surface, and on this build here, that seems to have been prevented, or that has been spared that type of a procedure. That's awesome. It's going to make my job a hell of a lot easier and faster to undertake. There is some mild scratch work on the MG ball over here, but that's very easily addressed with some cast texturing. But there is some weld mark enhancements, and I'm using that term very loosely, found on certain sections, and this is something I am going to clean up, and something I have touched upon in the past in other videos. So I'm just going to rinse, wash, and repeat with those procedures to take care of that. The barrel is salvageable, but as you can see, the seam removal method is pretty sloppy. It's just the red tube tester's glue, just applying this section over here and rub over it. This is actually quite similar how I do the technique these days. The only difference is that once the glue sets, I hit it with some sandpaper in order to polish it down. So apparently I'm already halfway there, so just with some sandpaper and needle file, I'll be able to refine this to its appropriate manner. One other thing that stuck out at me are the interior periscopes. These were complete Donnybrook when I did them the first time, so I'm going to go ahead and amputate them all out. I have a couple spare ones, again, from the other Jagdpanther. I'm going to make a mold of them because I don't have enough plastic, OG plastic ones, in order to do the repair. But I'll just simply make a mold and cast them in resin, and you know, these things kind of come in handy for certain builds here and there. But other than that, yeah, this is actually a pretty clean rebuild so far. Oh, and of course, I am going to take care of this droopy barrel that we have here, but that was, of course, a given. On the lower hull, it seems to be in really good shape. The torsion bars line up pretty good on this side. However, on this side, it's a little bit more haphazard, and you can see there are drifting a little bit. The worst offender is this front one that we have here. This is something that definitely needs to be addressed. The other ones aren't too bad. I could probably just torque them, like I mentioned in the Italeri M163 video that I did a little while ago. Similar type of procedure. This one here may or may not survive that procedure, but again, fortunately, I have a backup plan, being that other runner that has the other torsion bars mint in box, so there's no point, you know, making a mold of it since I have a whole sprue of the parts ready to go. But again, we'll see if that comes to that point. But yeah, these ones here, not the greatest, but also far from being the worst. So after fiddling with the model a little bit more, I was able to remove a few more components that are going to need to be cleaned up and then remounted or replaced as the build goes on. The major area that was fiddled with was with the lower. As you can see, several of the swing arms have been broken. Like I may have touched upon earlier, some of these swing arm pieces were not installed in an appropriate way, and so they were janky with the overall appearance. And also, a few of them had signs of damage and were repaired at some point in the past. And even once the piece was repaired originally, they too were not in line with the remainder of the swing arms, which again was going to cause an issue when it came time for the reinstallation of the road wheels and the remainder of the suspension. So it's best to just cauterize and replace them completely, and this is the perfect opportunity to do so. Fortunately, the procedure is pretty straightforward. It's actually something that I've shown in great depth in an earlier OTR video. The subject matter on that video, of course, was a Tamiya Russian Joseph Stalin III heavy tank, where it needed the exact same type of modification, or I should say repair, be made to the swing arms. Only on that build, it was a little bit more advanced because I needed to have replaced all of the swing arms, as opposed to this build here where it's only a select few. However, the actual technique is going to be identical. Another difference between the two builds was that on that one I actually had to make a mold of the Tamiya swing arm in order to cast fresh resin replacements and drop them into their appropriate locations. For this one here, that's obviously not going to be necessary because, as I touched upon before, I have that runner that's a complete spare from another Tamiya Panther kit that gives me an entire fresh set of Tamiya plastic swing arms and other suspension parts. So no need to make a rubber mold since I have the originals on hand, which would otherwise be sitting in a spare parts bin. So that's actually going to cut down on the complexities quite a bit. However, if I did not have that runner on hand, I would of course do the exact same technique with taking a swing arm from the new kit, making a mold of it, and then casting the replacements, as I did on the Joseph Stalin III. Before I go ahead and start repairing it, other things that I went ahead and removed at this time were the exhaust manifolds. The exhaust manifolds could have been polished and reworked a bit. However, again, since I have a fresh set on hand, I'm just going to utilize those on this build. These ones here were salvageable, but there were some mistakes that were made, but I found it easier just to directly replace them altogether. This one here broke off very, very clean without any problems. However, this one, not so much. There's still some shards left over from the original exhaust manifold mount that's in place over here, and this is something that is going to have to be cleaned up prior to the new one being fitted in place. So now that you see what has been demolished, let's go ahead and begin the actual rebuild. I'm going to first clean up these areas over here, and then once these are done, I'll be able to drill out and clean up the remainder of the shards found on the swing arms. Once all of the cleanup is done, it's then time to start reconstruction, which is basically the whole point of this video. With the rear plate polished down, it's now time to turn my attention to the remainder of this swing arm repair. The first thing I need to do is to remove the clunk left over on the side sections here, which are the carcasses of the original swing arms. This needs to be removed fully and cleanly in order to prep the surface for the next step. In order to remove the shards here, this is going to be done with a Dremel high-speed removal bit. This is one of the smaller size ones and can be found in just about any hardware store, or also you can pick it up online. During the removal process, I only need to focus on the little block portion here of the remnants that are left, but the one thing that I really need to avoid hitting at all costs are the little pegs that we have right here molded into the side. These little pegs are really important because these set the suspension height and allow the suspension to stay in line with each other. How did I screw this up the first time around during the assembly is your guess as good as mine, but regardless, these pegs here really need to have an effort in being focused on so that I don't hit them. If they are removed for one reason or another, it's not a total loss. I can still go ahead and set the height appropriately since I do have the remaining suspension pieces properly set at the correct height. So it's something that could still be done, but I do want to take my time making sure I don't knock those pins out because it does make the job a little bit easier. Once the carcass is removed, it's then time to start with the drilling. But before I do, I just want to mention that when you're removing the carcasses, you want to make sure that the area is as flat and as straight as possible. Obviously, this is going to really come to effect once the swing arms go on, and you don't want them to be mounted in a canted manner. Once the pieces were removed with the Dremel, the needle file here made short work of squaring everything off. Before I go ahead and actually start with the drilling, one thing that I do want to take care of at this point here is with the front sections where the final drives are. You see, with the way the kit is designed, these are separate sections that get glued in place. It assembles very easily. However, one thing that you are left with is a seam found in this area right over here. And it's one thing that I just want to take care of at this point before I progress further with the drilling. And this is going to be some quick little body work. I'm just going to use some thick super glue. I'm just going to put a bead into these locations over here, and then with some sandpaper, I'm just going to simply polish them down. Once this is done, I could then commence with the remainder of the drilling. Okay, so with those seams polished away, and with the detour taken care of, it's time to turn back to the swing arms. The swing arms are in these locations over here, and it's actually fairly easily to distinguish what was the original swing arm and what was the portion of the hull. If you look closely, you should be able to see a discoloration between the swing arm material and also the material from the lower hull itself. It's definitely more noticeable, or at least it should be, on this side, and hopefully it should come out on camera, but you should see a small round indentation right over here, and that is the original swing arm that was glued in place. Well, when you're repairing these, you need to drill them out, and the best way to do that is on the drill press. This is to ensure that the hole is drilled nice and straight, because if it's drilled into an angle, this is going to cause further alignment problems. One other thing that needs to be factored in is the location of the center point of where the axle for the broken swing arm is found. You want to drill dead center, because this will ensure that the drill bit only eats away the material of the swing arm axle and not the hull itself. This is something that, too, if it's off, may cause alignment problems. In order to ensure that the holes are nice and straight, instead of drilling the hole with the drill press, the first hole I'm going to be drilling is with the Dremel, and I'm going to be using a much smaller Dremel bit that we have here. This is a 1.15 millimeter Dremel bit. These I procure from my bit vendor, which can be found in the video description as well as in the link right here below. And these Dremel bits I use on many models for, just hole purposes, but for this type of an application, it's absolutely crucial. So I'm going to go ahead, swap out the Dremel bit, and I'm going to carefully put a small hole in the center portion. And again, with the way the discoloration is on these parts, it really helps out. If you want to be really specific, you can also take a pencil and mark the area before you go in with the Dremel. Whichever way you feel comfortable with will work for this procedure. When you're drilling in, you want to go at a nice, slow, controlled speed to prevent the bit from overheating and the plastic melting around it. This is true for every time you drill with the plastic. And with that hole drilled out, if you go on the inside here, you will see that the hole popped out right where the original kit air vent hole is found. Which means the hole is dead center, which is exactly what you're looking for. Let me see if I could repeat the exact same type of success on the other two examples. With the pilot holes drilled out, it's now time to move the operation to the drill press where it can complete the drilling process. So here's the drill press with the bit fitted in place. I'm using an 1/8 of an inch drill bit in order to do the drilling. If we look at the runner over here, you'll see that the axles have a slight taper to them, which shouldn't cause any problems with the hole being drilled in a straight manner. As I touched upon in the Joseph Stalin 3 video, you want to make sure that the hull is held in a perfectly straight and square manner to ensure that the hole is drilled in that type of a method. If you're canted one way or another, this can lead to issues. The minorest being that, well, it's going to take a little bit more fiddling to get the swing arm fitted in place, or at worst, you can actually drill through the lower plate over here, which will cause way more problems. So you want to ensure that the thing is nice and square. There are ways to do this. If you have a drill press, you can use blocks of metal that are squared off, or another type of T-square, in order to make sure it's nice and straight and true. But really, I like to just use my eye, and then, you know, I have some pretty good experience with this so far, so it should work out just fine. So let's go ahead and fire up the drill press. As you can see, the holes were drilled out in a nice and true manner. Same is true for the opposite side. And the holes were so clean that the drill bit just simply punched out the rear wall found on these sections here. This obviously will have absolutely no effect at all on the reinstallation of the new replacement swing arms. As for those, well, nothing really much to talk about. It's just simply snipping them off with a sprue and mounting them onto the model as the kit originally would have intended. Okay, so obviously you really want to pay attention to the alignment, because this is kind of what screwed me up the first time around. This side here came out pretty good. This side here, some of the other swing arms are not exactly in line. However, they are definitely close enough. You don't have to be a dead ringer on all of these swing arms, but you know, there is a certain threshold that they could be in, and the build could still turn out to be just fine. And the way you see it here, this is definitely within that margin. Just for some extra support, I'm going to add a drop of glue on the inside portion here of these wells, just so that there's just a little bit more extra adhesive, keeping these swing arms at bay. So I'm just going to set this aside and let the thing dry. With the lower hull basically ready to go, I now turn my attention to the upper. Before I go ahead and secure the two sections in place, there are some repairs and other refinements I need to make to this section over here, which will aid with the final assembly. Some of the revisions are going to include the removal of several of the details. Two of which, of course, being the track racks that we have here on the side. As I mentioned before, they didn't hold up very well during the paint stripping process, or I should say the track removal process. And fortunately, I do have replacements on hand, and in order to mount those on, these here need to be fully amputated. I'll be touching more upon that in a second. For the other refinements, this would include taking care of some glue marks, which you can see are pretty abundant in this rear section over here. It's not too egregious. Should polish down with some sandpaper with a little bit of elbow grease. Other things to contend with, which are the most important, are refining the weld marks that I added to these sections over here. This is something that was done with the Dremel, and fortunately it's very easily taken care of, as I've touched upon in several other of these OTR videos. So at this point here, I should have this down to a science. Other repairs are going to include the replacement of the periscopes. The kit did originally have these components glued in place. However, I botched the installation back in the day where I installed them, but they were on cockeyed or not even fully inserted, and it was just a complete mess. They were unsalvageable, so I simply just went ahead and amputated them fully. I do have some spare Tamiya 1s on hand, but I also made a mold of the Tamiya 1 and casted some Tamiya resin replacements, which should obviously just drop directly into place once the areas are prepped and deglued. Obviously, with the way the pieces were installed originally, there's a bit of glue chunks left on the inside over here, which is going to inhibit the installation. So this is something I am going to take care of. while I was cleaning up the rear engine deck area from those glue marks, one thing I wanted to mention was how this was actually done, because this is something that could probably come in hand for several other builders out there for other projects. The first thing that I did was I actually plucked off temporarily the 2 hatch stops that are found right here on the engine hatch. Those are right here slightly off camera, and they were simply yanked off with adding a little bit of pressure just with my finger. Fortunately, with old glues being old, they just broke away without any real problems. The pieces are, of course, going to be reattached after the sanding is done, and it's a good thing, too, because they were not located in the correct locations, but more on that later. And with them removed, this gives me ample amount of space, or just enough amount of space to get in here with the sandpaper. Now, in order to sand these sections down, it's going to be really difficult to get in there with just some sandpaper, just because of how big your fingers are or how big the sandpaper is. So one trick that I use, and this is something I mentioned in the other Jagdpanther restoration video, is to take the sandpaper and you bunch it up into this small little section that we have here and grip it with a plier. This allows you to get into really tight confines now and to polish away the locations that need the work. Because you are able to focus the sandpaper into the areas that need the actual sanding, this gives the most amount of sanding potential on that one little spot as opposed to hitting the other areas. This type of procedure is fantastic if you're working in an area like this where you have a lot of little bits of detail molded on, and allows you to basically snake in and take care of the work that needs to be done. Obviously, right here on this engine deck, that's definitely going to be the case. So I'm just going to go over here and just polish down the necessary areas, which this sandpaper is really making short work of it. The Chester's red tube glue is just giving way, and once it's totally gone, you can see just how much more improved everything looks as a whole. Also, at this point here, you can see that I went ahead and refined the edges on all those plates that I chipped away with the Dremel. And I also went ahead and did a similar technique over here with the puzzle sections, and I used a X-Acto knife, or I should say my miniature box cutter blade over here, to just go up and down these sections, refining it further. I did have a slight oopsie where the blade skipped off of the channel and put a gouge into the plastic. This is something that can happen, but fortunately it's very easily addressed. Right, the gouge was very, very light, and right now just a drop of super glues in this area over here, and once that's fully set, I'll be able to polish it down further with the same sandpaper that I have here. Only with the area that I'm working with, I don't need to bunch it up. I can just, take care of it by hand. This is going to be done once the bodywork back here is also concluded. And on that note, you can see how the 2 spare track rack sections were amputated, but with the procedure, it did leave a small little indentation where the bit made the passes, so this was something I polished down as well. This area here could have theoretically been plated over with the replacement track rack, but I just wanted to be thorough, make sure it's all nice and smooth, just to prevent any sort of potential hiccups. The MG ball area also received a similar type of refinement. There were a couple of those stupid little tick marks found in this section over here, but they were really superficial and polished down with hardly any effort. Right now I'm just going into the weld bead area and just making sure everything is nice and smooth, and it's also, more importantly, nice and neat. Well, the rebuild was going by really easy, so easy in fact that I decided to add some complications to it by thickening the plot. You see, one problem that this model had was that the barrel was really, really floppy, which tends to happen on older builds, or even stock. A lot of times, if the tolerances are really loose, you're going to get some flop going on. Well, one easy way to fix this is with a little drop of white glue into certain areas. It solidifies it up, kunks it up, and then it'll keep the barrel where it needs to be, but still allow it to be fully motional. So one thing that I did was I used a little drop of thin super glue over here, just a small little drop, because this can do the same thing on some occasions. On this occasion, what it did was it actually solidified the piece in place, so when I went to move it, I actually cracked it off. So now, this entire unit needs to be removed, which is not really easily done because the mantlet is really glued on quite well. So, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to go ahead and cut the barrel right over here behind the mantlet, pop it off, and that'll allow me then to go ahead and rebuild the pivoting structure. So to do this, well, first the inner detailing here just cracked right off. That's something I could easily address later on. And to sever the barrel, I'm going to use a mini router bit that we have here on my Dremel. So with a careful incision, I was able to take it off. Now I could actually start the reconstruction. Okay, so this thing's really jammed up pretty good, so I'll use the bonder on that just to undo the dumb mistake that I made. I'll just drop that in right there. By the way, this is the bonder that I utilize. Its stuff is found on Amazon, and it works like a charm. So I'm not really too concerned about that. As you can see, this is where the pivoting point snapped, so I'm going to go ahead and drill this out and replace it with an actual metal fastener. This will do a fantastic job with keeping the piece permanently fitted in place and also allow it to still fully rotate. But I'll get on that in a moment. As for this area here, I'm going to clean this up, and if anything, it's kind of a good thing because one mistake that I made on this model when I first built it was, for one reason or another, the mantlet was not glued on properly. It was slightly sticking past the point here, more than it really needed to be. It didn't look bad, it wasn't something that was noticeable, so I was able to, basically live with it, but now that I have the unit removed, I could actually make the appropriate modifications to get the pieces seat in fully. Also, now that the piece is removed, I can go ahead and paint this separately from the model, which will allow me to get this area here thoroughly painted, which on a Jagdpanther, once the unit is mounted in place, it becomes really tricky to go ahead and get paint thoroughly into these recesses. So, in a way, I'm not going to shed any tears. There is a little bit damage over here on the mantlet where I tried to, budge the glues loose. Instead, the plastic cracked slightly. It's not a whole lot. It's just a little bit. So I went ahead and just snapped the piece back in its hole. And with the same super thin CA that caused this issue, I'm just going to go ahead and drip a nice little amount right into there, which should go ahead and seal it back up. Just make sure I tweak the plastic sections in place where they need to be with a... Okay, so that cracked off on me fully. So yeah, this is escalating pretty quickly. No biggie. I could go ahead and just re-glue this in place with some super glue. Make sure that everything lines back up where it needs to be. And presto, the piece has been fully repaired. By the way, that was completely unscripted, so that just happened. With the CA added in place over there, that should be more than suffice for jamming everything up and making sure that it re-solidifies. Okay, so that out of the way, and with the debonder here doing its magic. Come on, buddy. Let's go ahead and get loose. Yeah, it's seized on there pretty good. Okay, so I'm just going to have to let it just sit with the bonder here. I only added the bonder, by the way, on one of those points, so it's going to take a little bit of coercion to free that up. If worse comes to worse and that cracks, I do have a insurance policy on hand, so it's not a problem. You have to roll with the punches sometimes when you're doing a build. One other thing that this allows me to do is to do the body work, or I should say the seam removal on the barrel over here with much more ease compared to having it dangle on the upper hull and trying to polish around it. I could still have done it, but it's easier in this format. So I guess I might as well go ahead and take care of that at this point here while other things are either dissolving or other sets of glue are drying. So while I was doing the seam removal work on the main tube, one thing that I wanted to mention is that on the Jagdpanther, and this is also true for the King Tiger, and to a lesser extent on the Tiger 1, there are several little details found on this section here on the rear portion of the main tube. And on the Jagdpanther, you have several lines that are integrally molded into these sections over here, and then there's this step-down section that also has some interesting geometry to it. On the Tamiya moldings, all these details are nicely represented. However, when you're going through the seam removal process, when you're using some kind of a additive media, either a putty, a super glue, or as I did in this case, red tube model glue, these areas tend to clunk up pretty easily. And once they clunk up, you really have to remove them and do it in a way that's pretty symmetrical and in a way to just keep the continuity of the part. And this is something that may be a little bit trickier for some more novice builders out there. For me, the way I like to do it is that after I use the sandpaper and the needle file to polish down the main flat sections, to re-add these lines, I'd like to mount the unit into my lathe. With the lathe, I'm able to then take a needle file and recarve all of these sections that I'm referring to. The lathe does a fantastic job with keeping everything at a symmetrical and even depth, and it also allows it to be nice and true as opposed to possibly yawing if you're doing this technique freehand. Obviously, this is something that is for people who have a setup like this here where you have an actual lathe in your shop. If you are one of those individuals that don't have a machine lathe, it's going to be a little bit trickier to do the procedure. You can still do it with a needle file or maybe even a tubing cutter. Actually, I think a tubing cutter would work too, but you have to be very careful with that. But perhaps that's something that, you know, you could look into. But if you don't have the lathe, yes, you are going to be at a disadvantage when it comes to re-adding these details here. The needle file of choice that I like to use is the triangular one, which is right over here. And these come in all of those needle file sets that you can find either in Harbor Freight or Amazon.com. What I like about the triangular one is that it allows me to really get into a pinpoint location in order to carve out the notch required. And it's also really good for that interesting portion right there on the cap portion. Another thing, by the way, that you could use the lathe for is for actually smoothing out the tubes in a symmetrical manner. Not so much on this one here because it has the mantlet attached, but if you don't have the mantlet attached, you could secure that end into the chuck, and then with the sandpaper, you could go up and down the surfaces, which will be able to sand the units down. This is a technique I've used in the past periodically. It's not something that I always use, but, you know, depending on the situation, perhaps it's something that can help with the build. By and large, though, that's not really that necessary, and the majority of my builds, that's not really the method that I use in order to do the seam removal. But again, it is something to know about and have in your toolbox. Specifically, of course, if you have the lathe. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start with the cutting. Before I actually go and start committing with the tool, the first thing I'm going to do is mark the locations with a pencil. For reasons that should be fairly obvious. You don't want to be second guessing on where the line is, specifically when the thing is spinning and you're actually beginning to cut chips. Definitely something you want to make sure you have ironed out. So what I'm going to do is, with the lathe on, I'm going to go ahead and mark it. Like so. Once the unit is marked, or the locations are marked, I then go ahead and start with the actual carving. Once I'm happy with the lines, with some sandpaper, I'm going to go ahead and smooth out the new carved in sections in a very quick way. And hopefully the footage here is in focus, and you get to see the carved lines that have been added. I'm going to do the same thing, but on the opposite side here with the muzzle brake. However, this may or may not be possible due to the mantlet in the way, as I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be able to secure it. This is going to be a bit problematic. Let's see if I could jimmy it in. Nah, it's just not going to work out. Okay, so on this example over here, I'm actually going to go ahead and do this the old-fashioned way with the use of a needle file, but I'm going to do it freehand. Fortunately, these areas here aren't too clunked up, so the old-school method should work just fine. So as you can see, the freehand method will also get you the same result, but it will take a little bit more work and a little bit more caution compared to doing it on the lathe. Regardless, both roads will still take you to Rome. So with the tube sections, so now that the seam removal has been completed, it's now time to reconstruct the damage that I did to these sections here. Also, by the way, you can see the unit now has its pivoting function back, special thanks to the super solvent. And it should be a bit stiff in keeping the unit up. Regardless, I'll probably add a drop of Elmer's glue in there for good measure. Now, it's time to go ahead and start with the actual reconstruction. On the rear section over here, the unit received a bit of damage. Now, it's not that important. The interior detailing doesn't really mean a whole lot on this particular build, but, you know, I do want to have it together regardless. The best way to do so is I'm going to square off the edges on both of these areas over here, and I'm going to see if I could either find a tube that's this diameter or possibly turn one out of resin on the lathe. Once I have those two sections, it's just going to be a plug-in installation. On the front section over here, it's going to require a little bit more work, but it's the exact same type of method that I'm going to utilize. On the front portion over here, this is what it looked like originally, and as you can see, there's now a gouge cut into this section over here due to the material that was removed from the router bit that I mentioned before. So this is going to take a little bit more reconstruction. What I'm going to do with this is I'm also going to square off these sections both on the rear portion of the mantlet and also on this portion over here on the center tube. Then I'm going to turn some resin on the lathe in order to fit into these confines, and it's going to bridge the gap and everything is just going to plug together lickety-split. To do this, this is going to be all done with the Dremel with the high-speed removal bit that I showed earlier. I'm also going to use a router, and I'm also going to need to use a file in order to square everything off. The router bit's also going to be crucial in order to hollow out this section over here. With the way the piece is designed, you can see shards left over from the mantlet and also from that peg that emerges from the kit tube in order to plug everything together. So it's going to take a little bit of reconstruction to pull this off, but I'm more than confident I could make do with this. The other thing I'm going to need to do is drill out this section over here that the peg was originally found for the unit to pivot, and drill out the corresponding location right here on the bottom portion of the mount. This is then going to be tapped, and then I'm going to go ahead and secure this unit in place when the time comes with a metal M3 fastener, which after a few drops of glue are added, it's going to return the pivoting nature, and it's going to be a hell of a lot stronger than it was originally. So now that you have the battle plan, let's go ahead and implement it. So with the carriage rebuild work out of the way, and with the hole drilled in for the pivot, here you can see the new fastener. This is or I should say it started off as an M3 by 16 millimeter fastener, but the 16 length was a little bit too long for what I needed, so I shortened it to about a little more than about 6 millimeters, if that, maybe 7 or 8. I don't know, some European viewer out there should easily chime in with that. I basically just, hand fitted to make sure it was at a height that secures to both of the top and bottom portion here of the mount, but it's not too much where it's going to inhibit the barrel from going up and down. So now that this here is at the appropriate height, it's time for the main installation. So I'm just going to add some drops of CA here. Normally on my other builds I would use Loctite for this, but since the pieces are plastic and because this is a static model, super glue is more than suffice for the job at hand. Just go ahead and quickly deburr this. There we go. Okay, so put a little drop of glue right there. Okey-dokey. Now I can go ahead and get this in place. Line it up, and I'll be able to then get the fastener where it needs to be. Because the part is tapped, I should just go ahead and start threading in here, and it should engage once it finds that nice little happy sweet spot. And there we go. Alright, I'm just going to tighten it a little bit off screen. Okay, so it's in, but it still has a little bit of a wobble to it. Let me see if I can tighten it some more. The trick is you don't want to over tighten it. This is just polystyrene, so it can easily strip out if over torqued. There you can see the part now secured in place. It's on in a fairly stiff manner, but you can see it can still fully rotate. I am going to add a drop of super glue right there on the inner portion over there, just to give it a little bit of extra strength. But it's doing a really good job. Of course, I am also going to add a little drop of white glue right there to those pivot points, just to stiffen it up in the elevation department. And, well, at that point there, the repair work is completed. There we go. That should keep that at bay. Well, I might as well just do a dry test run. So, let's see if I could just slide this bad boy in place. And, ta-da, it works just fine. Obviously, this is something that's definitely going to be installed after the paintwork, which will also make for maneuvering of the model during the construction go by a little bit easier, because these things tend to get in the way. That's really all you need in terms of white glue. So from here, the white glue is going to set, and at that point there, a nice little pop, and the piece will be able to go up and down, but it won't droop, specifically once the remaining section of the barrel is fitted in place. With the barrel work taken care of, I'm now going to finish off the remainder of the details that need to be installed from the inside, just before I can go ahead and get the top fitted to the lower. The first of which will be the little optic that we have right here. This is the kit unit. It cracked off at some point during the strip down, and it's a good thing that it did that, because this allows me to then go ahead and drill out the lens section over here with the Dremel with this small router bit, which will give a nice little added detailing of having the lens area now more prominent. This, of course, will really come into fruition after the model's painted, and I go ahead and do the various effects with the clear lacquer and all that other stuff to give the lens detailing. In order to drill it out, though, I have my Dremel here with the small micro router bit. I'm just going to put a small little indentation dead center. This is the type of technique where you really need to have a steady hand, because if you're not, or if you're not in the dead center, it's going to be a little bit wonky and it can actually hurt the look of the item. And that's all there is to it. So I'm going to go ahead and re-secure this to the model, and then also install on the remainder of the periscopes. Here you can see one of the replacement periscopes that I casted in resin. As I mentioned before, this was made as a mold from one of the Tamiya ones that I had spare from the way the runners were laid out. The spare one was utilized, but obviously I was going to be a number short, so the resin ones here will definitely make up the difference. Also, in case anyone is wondering, or if you're working on one of these Jagdpanthers, it's really good to go ahead and install these prior to the upper and lower hulls being glued together, because I actually made that mistake once, and I was still able to get everything through. Fortunately, the mantlet here wasn't fitted yet, but let's just say it added a little bit more complexity to the build, as opposed to just fitting them on at this point here. Also, you want to make sure that the periscopes are fully seated in place. And once they are, you want to set it aside and wait for the glues to set. On this one over here, there's this little guard that is present. The guard was originally glued on and popped off, and I actually have it right here. However, this guard is actually the wrong part for this section over here, and I must have made that snafu when I was younger, but fortunately I caught it today. Luckily, with the way the runner's laid out, there was one of these guards on the sprue, and so I went ahead and just simply snipped it off and secured it to this model right here. Once fitted in place, it obviously finished off the top portion of the detailing. Also, at this point, you can see that the stave tube has been fitted in place. It has been primed in flat black because I went ahead and did the body work on the seam removal. Took care of that off camera, there's no point getting that shown, but basically went over with the sandpaper and the needle file. And once it was done, I spray painted it black just to make sure that there are no gaps remaining. And also, it's good to thoroughly paint it so that it eliminates the potential of there being any spots missed after the model goes into its actual paintwork. Some other small little details have been refitted, like the headlight here, which may or may not be a good idea. The little flap here for the periscope, generally on the last, or I should say on the other Jagdpanther build, this is installed at the very end of the build, but for this one here, installing at this point shouldn't be a problem. And I also went ahead and secured on the side skirts mount. When this was done originally, this was a complete abysmal failure. They were all over the place. I was missing 3/4 of them. And fortunately, I had the side skirts on, so that basically covered up most of the issue. But since I have access to a whole spare set of them, I secured them to this side. And prior to securing them, I actually went ahead and made a mold and casted some replacements. One of the original ones was salvaged and was simply utilized in place. So it's definitely going to carry on with the model moving forward. This is something that I potentially should have done after the two halves were together, but I think I should be able to make do. But realistically, this is something that you should do after the hulls are glued together. So definitely don't listen to me on that one. Do that after the upper and lower hulls are together, because you may have to do some sanding or some glue work on the inside over here, and these pieces here are a bit frail and can pop off. As for why I went ahead and secured them on at this point, more than likely because I needed something to do. I was waiting for resin to set, and I said, screw it, let me just go ahead and glue them on. But realistically, don't do that. Do it after the two hulls are together. And on that note, before I go ahead and glue two hull heads together, one thing I do want to take care of, and something that's been bugging me since I built this model, is with the rear engine hatch. As you can see, it's not fully sitting flat. It sticks up just slightly, and it's just enough to bug me. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to secure it in place in a permanent manner. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to put pressure on this side over here and put a few drops of thin liquid super glue on the inside portion here. The CA is going to get sucked into this little gap, and it's just going to secure the component in place. Since I have it pressed down, it's going to adhere in that format, and then that one little annoying quirk is no longer going to be present. And since my applicator tips are completely and utterly worn out, I'm just going to use the wire technique right here. So just hold that down for about a minute or so. This is fast drying stuff, so within no time the glue should set. And then I should be able to let go without the hatch springing up. Just like so. Alright, so with that out of the way, it's now time to secure the upper and lower hull halves together again. So with the body set aside to allow the adhesives to fully set, I might as well turn my attention to some of the more ancillary items that are required to flesh out the build. And that leads us to the spare track links that we have here. Of course, the Jagdpanther is iconic along with the Panther of having spare track links secured to the rear sides on racks that are found on the hull. And the Tamiya kit here is absolutely no different. As we can recall, the model did originally have the kit supplied spare track links secured to the sides. However, they were a complete mess, and rather than trying to polish them up, it's better to just cauterize them completely and replace them with a new set. Fortunately, finding a set of Panther links, specifically individual link and link links, is not hard to do in this shop because I never use them for anything. So for the application here, the link and links are actually pretty good. For the examples that we have here, these are Tamiya Panther tracks, and here you can see the runner that they came from. This runner here came off of the other Tamiya retooled Jagdpanther kit that I've already touched upon in several occasions in this video. And with the way the kit is designed, even if you build the model using all of the rack locations in pairs no less, you will still have plenty of spare links remaining to outfit an entire other Jagdpanther or Panther. In fact, there's even more than that because they give you 2 of these runners. I guess they figure, you know, one, it's always good to have spare parts, but the second thing is these tracks are so crappy and hard to put together that they probably figure people are going to screw up a couple times before they get a full set. So 2 runners, you know, is more than enough. Well, with that aside, as we know, my hatred for link and link track is legendary, but for spares here, they actually work pretty good if you take your time and you are very careful with the assembly. And that's exactly what's going on over here. So for my Panthers, I like to have the track links always up in pairs unless there's one reason or another where I can't fit the track in place. And this is basically something that was seen on the old school Jagdpanther kit that I rebuilt, but you know, more about that info is in that other video. As for this one here, the track racks can be fully fleshed out and they look pretty good. The links are just glued in place, as you can see right here, but one little trick about the Panther links is how I assemble them for the spares. This is something that you'll see on many of my Panther builds, specifically ones that utilize a individual or even a workable link for the spares, and that is with the curvature that we have right here. One little detail spice you can add to your Panther or Jagdpanther builds is that when you're securing the tracks in place, you really don't want to have them in a straight line. And this is something that I actually learned from not just seeing real examples of both these vehicles, but also from my personal experience with handling the 1/6 scale Armor Tech and the other 1/6 scale Panther, or Jagdpanther I should say, it's in my collection. When you fit the working tracks onto the sides on the actual track racks, they will not sit flush against the side of the hull because of the way the rack is designed and also with just the way the geometry is of the Panther back there. They will not just lie in a straight line. Instead, they will have a little reverse curve to them like you see right here. This little curve is really easily added, and it's one of those things that will give your build just a little bit of extra detailing compared to just leaving them flat. In fact, it's something that if you add to your build, and once it's complete, it'll really have a very unique little feature to it that will set it aside from the rest in the pack. And if anyone knows a thing or two about these tanks and sees that, they'll be like, aha, you know, I see what you did there type of a thing. So this is something, it's a little subtle bit of detailing, but it's one that I personally want to mention for this particular example. On the tracks themselves, as far as crap individual link and links go, this one is not too bad, specifically with the skies that you're using them as spares. The problem with link and length is when you start amassing a large length of them, this is when things can become problematic, and it's always the death nails when you try to wrap them around a curved object like an idler or even worse a sprocket and then try to have them contort to those curvatures. It never works. They're crap. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I'll berate these things. High and low, individual link and link tracks are absolute dog crap. But for spares, if you're using a small little segment here, they work okay. Granted, if you take your time. So, as you can see, the links were separated off of the sprue. This is easily done with a clean cut snip. And then I'm just going to quickly deburr them with a needle file. Just a few passes, really isn't all that's required to polish them down. You don't want to go overboard with the polishing, or else you'll take out too much of the grouser here on the side, and that's not really helping yourself. Do the same thing to the opposite one that I just dropped on the floor, but didn't bounce off too far. And again, a nice needle file here will make some short work of it. I like to use a needle file for this because it ensures that you can make the deburring in a nice, flat, even manner. And again, you want to take your time with it. And as long as you have some good hand-eye coordination, you should be able to do it in a nice, square manner. Once this is done, it's then time to glue the links together. I'm just going to use my tried and true bottle of super glue for this. I'm just going to add a small little drop of glue in each of these little hinge wells over here, and then the link just snaps into place. One thing I noticed about the Tamiya link specifically is that they do tend to click into place. Now, they're not functional by any means, nor does it hold them there very well, but they do self-align fairly well, again, in terms of individual link and lang track. Some other companies out there, namely some of the older kits from Dragon, this may be a little bit more problematic, but for the Tamiya one here, that's not really the case. So this is where link and lang track you really have to stay on the ball with. So once you glue the piece in place, you have to make sure that the hinge is securing in an even manner. It's very easy to have the piece glue in this type of way or this type of way. Now it's a bit over exaggerated, but it is something that can still happen. So once the hinge lines up, as you see, it's giving me a little bit of trouble. You just want to let it sit and let it set for a few seconds, specifically if you're using super glue like I am here. Once it hits a certain point in hardness, it's sticks to itself. You then want to just add a small little bend right there on the link, like so, making sure it is again as straight as possible because it could yaw on you if you're bending it slightly. And once you're happy with the curvature and also with the indexing, you just want to set it aside and let it dry. After a few minutes, the super glue will fully set, and once completed, the links are good to go. So as we saw earlier, the model received some damage on some of the details, and trying to repair them with the stock parts that I had on hand was definitely something that was less than ideal. So I figured I might as well go ahead and tool up new components in order to replace the broken bits. And of course, as what usually happens when I go down that path, it becomes a slippery slope, and I decide to go ahead and add some extra details that were just omitted on the Tamiya kits. And that led up to the runner that we see here. This is a new HD 3D printed set from East Coast Armory. This set here is specifically designed for the 1/35th scale Panther tanks of one flavor or another, but more or less it's intended for use on the Tamiyas. The unit has a bunch of components on it, so we'll start with the largest, which are the track racks. Obviously, this was meant specifically to replace the broken ones that were on the model. However, these ones here are improved. First, you'll see that the units have their weld beads in the locations right over there, which adds a little bit of more extra detailing. And also, you'll see, hopefully this pops up on camera, but the units are also drilled out. On the real Panther, the way the track links are held in places with a small little retention pin that secures everything and keeps them from flopping around. Well, with the older, 1990s tooling that these kits have, and also just with 1/35th scale in general, trying to emulate that in plastic is a bit problematic. However, with 3D print here, that does solve some design problems. So the holes are integrally printed onto all these sections. Hopefully they'll turn out better once it's painted, but rest assured they are most definitely there. The pieces are designed to be a direct replacement for the stock parts that are found on the Tamiya model, and the Tamiya track link should fit in the appropriate locations, or at least fingers crossed. We'll see how that pans out as the build continues. However, I made it as close as possible to the Tamiya spec ones as I possibly can. Also, on the sprue over here, for good measure, we have a number of German AFV antenna bases. This was, again, to repair the one that was on my model, which was damaged, years ago. However, this bit of detailing is something that is commonly broken, or in some cases just isn't really that well rendered on some of the kits on the market. So since I had the CAD file on hand, I might as well go ahead and throw it onto the set. The other improvement is something that is completely omitted by the Tamiya model, and that is what we have right here on the corner. If we look, you can see these small little hooks. These are those hooks that are around the fan intake area, and on the real vehicle, because of the way the plates are designed, they have these small little hooks present in order for you to hoist them up and get them out of the way to get access to the radiator and the cooling system. Well, for one reason or another, Tamiya omitted these details on their example, so I went ahead and just simply incorporated them on the set here. In fact, these here are also borrowed from the Jagdpanther, the old school Tamiya Jagdpanther conversion or detail upgrade set that I tooled up a little while ago when I did the OTR on the vintage Tamiya one, and the file is perfectly suffice for the modern version as opposed to the old one, so I simply just reincorporated on this set here. Just like on that set, the units are fully welded with their weld bead detailing present, and it's just a simple drop-in installation. In the past, this would be something that would generally be issued as a photo etch upgrade. However, in my opinion, as awesome as photo etch is, and if there's no other option out there, the photo etch is probably a good idea. However, it does have some deficiencies. First, it's the thickness of the part. The PE tends to be, in my opinion, a little overly thin. The second thing with the PE is that it's missing the weld beads, and trying to sculpt on weld beads in 1/35 scale, it's a task. It's definitely something that I don't want to do, and I don't do on my builds, admittedly, specifically 135, but with the units already integrally printed with the weld bead detailing present, it does save a lot of time in that respect. The last thing I want to mention is that on this one runner over here, you have enough components for more than one Panther. Obviously, there's enough for two with the racks, but you do have an ample amount of spares for the little hooks. Obviously, these pieces are very small, they could break or they could get flung, so it's a good thing that the piece does have plenty of extras in case you are, let's just say, accident prone. If, however, you play your cards just right and the planets line up appropriately, you should have enough components on here to outfit at least two Panther pattern vehicles. The sets here, because they are 1/35 scale, are not found on the standard EastCoastArmory.com catalog page. However, these instead are listed on the ECA Shapeways store, which the link can be found listed below in the video description. There, you'll see all the other components that I offer for smaller scale armored vehicle models, such as vehicles in not just 1/35 scale, some in 1/32, and even a few in 1/48. As for what they are, well, go ahead, swing by, check it out, and see if it's anything that you might be interested in. And here's the upper and lower hull now as one piece, and at this point the model is getting its final pre-paint details. So on the sponsons area, you can see that they did a little bit of putty work on these two locations. This was pretty easily done. On this side here, required a little bit more sanding compared to the one on the opposite side, just how this one turned out. And the procedure went by really quick and mostly effortlessly. I will say one complication were those little side skirt clips that I touched upon before. So again, if you're working on one of these Panthers or Jagdpanthers, be sure to install these after the upper and lower hulls are fitted in place. But regardless, I was still able to do the job without causing any collateral damage. From here, you can see some of the other components being remounted. The grill work has been mounted in place, and I also went ahead and fitted the cast resin replacement grill work that I touched upon earlier. Also at this time, I'm mounting on the new HD 3D printed Panther parts that I mentioned earlier in the video. And these just drop directly onto place on the Tamiya locations. With the way the Tamiya kit is designed, you have these two indentations found in these two locations for the piece to index properly. However, they are just indentations and they are not just simple holes. On the 3D printed component, there are three little columns that hold up the part for the printing process, and the one here in the center is one that needs to be deleted completely, while the other two on the ends line up with the original Tamiya parts. So I just simply polish away the middle one, drill out these two sections here with a pin vise, and then the replacement just drops directly into this location here. Once fitted, you can see how much more improved it looks compared to the original kit supplied Tamiya counterpart. Of course, this will be more appreciated once the unit is fully painted. Also, momentarily I'm going to secure on the remainder of the little bits that are on the sprue, but we'll circle back to that once the exhausts are fitted in place. So as the build churns closer to the end zone, here we have some of the added details. Starting with the hatch stops, the original kit hatch stops were not recycled for this build, not because of their quality or anything, it's just because, simply put, I misplaced them. When I put them down on this table over here, they kind of got absorbed by some of the other little shards and other plastic chunks, and since they're basically the same size, they're forever lost forevermore. So rather than spending some time worrying about that, fortunately I had some spares on hand, and the two you see here are from Dragon. On one of the other Dragon Panther builds that I recently completed, there were some spare parts, as Dragon kits generally give you, and some of the spare runners were from the Jagdpanther kit, and I did have a matching set of hatch stops, so I simply just utilized them in place. I personally like the Dragon ones over the Tamiya ones. In my opinion, the Tamiya ones are a little bit underscale, perhaps. I don't know, maybe there was one or more different variations of these hatch stops, but from several of the other examples I've seen, they tend to be a little bit bigger compared to the original Tamiya ones. I mean, the Tamiya ones are fine, for what they are, but I'm not going to be shedding any tears in favor of using the DML ones. The next thing that you'll see are the little lift hooks that we have here on the fan grill areas. These are absent on the Tamiya tooling, and these are the HD 3D printed components that I touched upon before. Now that you can see them fitted in place, you really get to see how much more extra detailing they give the rear deck here of the Jagdpanther model. One other thing to mention is the antenna base over here. The original one was not going to work, so I simply amputated and replaced it with the ECA 3D printed one. The antenna base originally had a little stub protruding from the section over there. However, as it turns out, when I was working on the rear engine hatch, one of the tools snagged that piece and it just snapped right off. Fortunately, it's not a problem. It was a nice clean break, and it was nice and flush, so it allowed me to drill the unit out. So now, after the model's painted, I can insert a wire in place for a proper antenna. Moving rearward takes us to the exhaust manifolds. As I mentioned before, the original ones are not going to be utilized on this build, and are swapped out with this set here that was spare from the other Jagdpanther that I recently completed. The Tamiya ones are pretty simple in their design. I personally like one of the ways they went about with molding it, as opposed to some of the other options from Dragon and Italeri, where they have a two-piece assembly where now you have a seam to contend with. On the Tamiya ones, it's just a tube, so this does make them easier in that regard. The top part has this really cool deflector detailing as a cap and just plugs directly into place. There's going to be a seam where those two locations meet, and this is something that does need to be polished away with some bodywork, which you can see that I've already done. One other detailing that I like to add is with the four fasteners found in these sections over here, as on the real unit, they are held in place via 4 rivets. However, the one weakness found on the Tamiya sets, in my opinion, is the bottom portion. Here you can see what the unit looks like stock out of the box, and from what I can remember from looking at the real Panther and Jagdpanther examples that I've seen in person, I don't believe that this is what it looks like underneath, and I think it's just sealed off. And this is something that's only seen on the Tamiyas, and it's not present on the other options of Jagdpanthers that are on the market, specifically some of the older ones that I've built, namely from Dragon and also Italeri. In order to improve this, I'm planing it over with this little piece here. The way I'm fabricating this a little bit is from some aluminum here, from a soda or seltzer can, in this case, and a hole punch. You just simply punch out the material, and this is a perfect size to fit on the exhaust manifold rear sections. If I carefully move this around, can add a small little bead of glue, and then the piece will just drop directly into place, like so. One thing I like about the hole punch is that if you position it with the punch end up, you will actually get a small little rib running along the disc. And this is something that's kind of another happy accident because it mimics the crimp line, which I think is present on the real exhaust manifold tubes, and just a little extra way to give that much extra detailing to the piece. The next thing that I'm going to be adding at this time is the crank handle start bracket, which is right over here. This is found on the old example that I have here in my parts bag, and I'm simply going to pop off the old one, clean it up a bit, and secure it on the new one. And then that's basically it. So, it has finally come down to this point. The model has been completely rebuilt, and at this point here, it's ready to slide off into paint. Before the model can even go into paint, it first needs to receive a thorough coat of primer. The primer is absolutely necessary prior to putting on any sort of color from any sort of brand. Be it from Tamiya, Model Master, Vallejo, you name it, there needs to be some sort of a surface primer on because it always tends to make the paint stick much better. Several builders out there recommend some other sort of product for the use of a primer, either from some kind of a specialty brand or some other type of material that's specifically designed for use on plastic models. However, I'm a bit different in that I don't use any of that stuff. If anything, I'm a little bit more archaic because I just roll with a simple can of El Cheapo flat black spray paint. This is the stuff that's found in Home Depot, and it's really, really affordable, which is fantastic because when you build as many models as I do, you know, costs tend to stack up quite quickly. So it's best to try to mitigate that as much as possible. So I like to use the flat black spray paint on my build. Some people like to use gray or red. Me, I personally like to use black because when the base coat goes on, the black just seems to work better. I don't know, it's weird. Some people tend to use a counter shading type technique where they paint the model all gray and then they edge the corners with an airbrush with black, and then, you know, they put on several thin layers of paint to get the coat, which, by the way, I hate that technique. I'm just gonna come out and say it. I don't like that technique. Some people just have the gray plastics poking through, which is even more bafflingly stupid. Don't do that technique. It's terrible. So I like to the way I like to build my models is I like to paint them with the base coat, and then I start adding the weathering and wash-ins to lighten it up or darken up the corners from that point. I'm not really a fan of doing it the opposite way, and there's some good reasons for that, one of which is just touching up. If you scratch that paint with that other technique, good luck trying, you know, to make that blend in. But regardless, so for my builds, I like to use the flat black spray paint here, and you just want to have a nice thorough coat on all of the surfaces. So I'm going to take the model outside and go ahead and get that taken care of. The road wheels, obviously, they're going to need to be painted as well. Now, this one's a little bit trickier because generally it's way easier to paint these components when they are still on the sprue. Obviously, with them being assembled like this, it adds a little bit of a complication, but it's something that can still be done. Only it takes a little bit more time and a little bit more effort, but regardless, you can still pull it off. On the topic of pulling things off, here we have the main tube right here. This is obviously going to be mounted permanently after everything is painted and weathered, because now this gives me ample access to this location over here to get it thoroughly painted with the primer and also the base coat. Hopping back to the spray paint, there are lots of different brands out there of spray paint. Some are more economical and the other ones are more premium with their pricing. And oddly enough, I found that the premium brands like Rust-Oleum or Krylon aren't really the best for plastic models. A lot of times those paints have some harsh chemicals on them that may cause some problems with the surface material that these models are molded in. So just stick with the cheaper stuff, and by and large you should have some way better results. When it comes to this stuff here, the one thing that you don't want to paint with it are the single piece vinyl tracks. Those are definitely not something you want to paint with these paints. In the past, I've had some good results with it, but I've also had some negative results where the tracks either just dissolve or dry rot on you over time, and neither of which is something that's ideal. For the track paint, that's going to be done with Tamiya acrylics, and you'll be seeing more of that as the video goes on. But for just the main areas of the model itself, no matter the brand of kit, I like to roll with the cheap stuff. The other thing to mention is that there are a few different brands out there of cheap stuff. This one, like I said before, is from the Home Depot. In my opinion, it's one of the better ones out there. Walmart does also have some pretty decent El Cheapo flat black, in case that's something that's more accessible to you. The ones that I don't really recommend too much are the ones from Lowe's. I've used them in the past. The paints are okay at best. The thing is, they tend to be a little bit more runnier compared to this stuff, and you'll still be able to do the job. I've used it on a number of builds, but it does take more than one coat to get done. So it is going to take longer to do as opposed to this stuff here, but in the end, both will be suffice for any sort of plastic model build. And with the wonderful weather we're having right now, I'm going to go ahead and get the model painted outdoors. Painting outdoors is something that I generally like to do, specifically when the weather and the season permits. You know, right now it's a late summer day, it's absolutely beautiful outside, and it just makes for a nice working environment for painting models, specifically when you're doing the base coat. When you're painting outdoors, one, you don't make a mess of the shop, which is something that you can easily do even with just a minimal amount of airbrushing. The second is it's just, you know, really enjoyable to spend time outdoors. And the third, it actually helps the paint dry faster with the sunshine that we have. The model, as you can clearly see, has been thoroughly primed with the flat black spray paint. The paint has been applied in a very consistent manner. Note there are no drips or any other type of imperfections that would plague other paint jobs. And same is also true for all of the running gear components. The other thing I want to mention is the photo etch. This model obviously is going to be getting some PE. The PE that we have here is a set from Edward. I personally like the old school Edward sets because they're somewhat readily available. They're also fairly affordable. And on top of that, one thing that I personally like about them is their simplicity. A lot of the PE sets out there, they cost more and you're getting a ton of other stuff. However, for what I'm looking for my builds, I really don't need the extra accessories that are on there. And I just hate buying something or specifically paying more money for something for components that I'm just not going to utilize. So with that in mind, the Edward sets here are absolutely perfect for just a simple type of Panther build. Painting photo etch is something else I want to mention, specifically grill covers. This is something that can definitely make or break a build. And you'll look at a lot of models out there, and some people just have trouble with getting grills painted and get them painted in a way where none of the slats or the grill mesh sections are plugged up with paint. And this is a hidden art form and a trick all in itself. When you're painting these grills, obviously you'll notice that they are not secured to the model at this time, and in my opinion, PE grill work are best installed at the very tail end of the build. For painting them, obviously the whole tank got primed with the flat black, but for photo etch grills, it's even more important to go ahead and thoroughly prime it before paint, because if you try to paint this without the grills primed, I always had experiences, and I've seen lots of people attempt it, and it gets clogged up every single time. So if you have the primer on the surface, this gives you a fantastic platform in order for the layers of paint to slowly build up. And within maybe 1-2 coats max, depending on how thin the paint is, you should be able to get the units painted without any sort of problems. The other thing I want to mention is even with applying the primer, you want to have the photo etch at just the right distance. I always found that the spray paint works best on meshwork when you're holding it at a good distance away, so that that buffer zone area where the spray gets emitted from the spray can and reaches the area here, the droplets seem to be a little bit more on the dry side, and because of that, they won't clunk up in certain areas, or at least that's my hypothesis. Regardless, I always had some excellent results from just holding the spray paint with a really good standoff from the grill covers themselves. A similar technique is also going to be done with the base coat that you'll see momentarily. While on the topic of the base coat, for the model here, the base coat I'm going to be utilizing my typical technique, which is exterior latex house paint. It's this flat paint, of course, and this is something that I've used on a number of builds in all different scales, from 172 to 135, 1/6, 1/16, you name it. I tend to utilize this technique because, well, it's really economical. You can get a whole quart of this stuff, possibly even a gallon, for a little over 20 bucks, as opposed to getting the little model paints that, you know, add up over time. Although there's nothing wrong with using model paints. Obviously, I use them myself on many other builds, but for my base coats, I tend to prefer going with a exterior latex format. For the camo work on this one, this tank, or I should say this tank destroyer or Panther variant, is going to be a little bit different compared to some of my other German builds that I've done in the past, where I go with a yellow dominant camo pattern, where the base coat would just be dunkelgelb. On this one here, I'm going to go with the opposite end and roll with a dunkelgrün dominant paint scheme. And this is easily determined if you're looking at what type of paint jobs to do. Basically, look at what the majority of the color is on the vehicle. If it's yellow, then you have a yellow dominant. If it's a green, you have a green dominant. And obviously, if there's more brown, you have a brown variant. I like to go with that route as opposed to possibly just painting the whole vehicle dunkelgelb and then adding the other colors over it. If there's more of one color than the other, that should be your base coat. Otherwise, you run the risk of adding extra layers of paint onto the surface, which really isn't helping you in the end. It could build up extra layers that are unnecessary, and then possibly can even obstruct certain fine details like weld lines and cast texturing and things like that. So if you're gonna do a paint job, you want to make sure you figure out what the base color is, or I should say the dominant color is for your base coat. For this one here, this is the dunkelgrün that I'm using. This color is the same color I've used on a number of German builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. And I'm just going to go ahead and top it off. So, like I said before, this is my own mix of exterior latex. The color I cobbled together many years ago, and then I just take it to the Home Depot and have them scan it and reproduce it in a flat latex format that we have here. One thing that I do recommend is getting these little tops for these cans, because it does make topping them off and filling them back up oh so much easier, as opposed to fiddling with the lid and trying to deal with a spoon. One other thing you need to learn if you're going to, or I should say what you need to master if you're going to go with the exterior latex method, is you have to have it at the right consistency. And by the way, it seems like people are watching and taking note of these videos, because I've seen on a number of forums out there, modeling forums, some individuals are using this technique and are even giving me a shout out. So if you're watching this, I see what you did there. The individual utilized this technique, and he actually had some pretty good results with it, but he himself had a learning curve to contend with. The first learning curve was priming it. The individual forgot to prime the model, and because of that, it required a little bit more prep work as opposed to applying the paint with the primer coat in place. And again, the primer coat could be anything from flat black, gray, or even red. The other thing that you need to really master if you're going to go with this type of medium is the consistency of the paint. The paint that comes out of the can is very, very thick and chunky, and this needs to be thinned out. One, it needs to be thinned out, even you can use a paintbrush on your house, but for an airbrush specifically, it really needs to be thinned out. Fortunately, thinning out the paint is something that's very, very easy. A lot of builders out there, they tend to go with some kind of a specific modeling paint primer, or I should say a paint thinner, based in alcohol or some other type of chemical. Me, I'm a little bit more archaic again. I just roll with tap water, straight up tap water. I just add the tap water to the paint, which you can see here is mostly chunky, or is more at a thicker consistency. Add a little bit of water to it and just stir it in. Sadly, this is something that I can't give a ratio over. This is the type of thing where it's all done by feel. After you've done this enough times, this will become second nature to you, and you will know exactly how much water to add. Why this is relevant is, well, with the airbrush and with the PSI that you're using, depending on both of those factors will depend on the type of consistency that you're looking for with your paint. And this is something else that individual basically had to figure out on his own, which, by the way, he did, because his model actually looks really, really nice. I think this should be a good start. Oh, one other thing I typically mention in these videos is that if you add too much water, fear not, you didn't ruin the batch. All you got to do is dump it right back into the can, shake it up a little bit, and then try it again. After a number of uses, the paint in the can will actually become to the consistency where you can just roll with it directly out of the can. But obviously, this takes a bunch of diluting attempts to do that, which happens actually naturally, because once you're done with the paint here, I just pour it back into the can and it's good to go for the next build. So this here seems like it's going to be okay. I'm going to add just a little bit more. And again, one thing you want to keep in mind, the saying that it's better to add lots of thin coats as opposed to one thick coat definitely comes to play. And if you're airbrushing the model and you notice that the paint is running way too much, well, don't worry about it. Just sit, let the thing fully set and dry, and then you reevaluate and you can proceed from there. For my airbrush, well, if anyone's seen my other OTR videos, you'll know which type of equipment that I use. And I use this Poshy VLS Pro airbrush. It's a double action airbrush, and when it comes to airbrushes, I prefer double action over single action. Double action gives you far much more control over the airflow and the paint in comparison to the single action configuration. For the air, I'm using my air compressor, and again, this is something that some people have some opinions over. Me personally, I don't like those hobby grade air compressors that you see in hobby shops or in big box type stores. I just don't like them. In my opinion, they're extremely anemic with the amount of air volume that it emits, and also with the duration of air that you have. When you were dealing with compressed air, you have not only the PSI in the can, but also how much volume is in there. And this is extremely important if you're doing something like a base coat, where you're going at a constant rate over the entire model. And specifically true if you're doing something larger scale, like in 1/16. Definitely that's the case in 1/6, where, you have a panel, the size of this table that I'm working on. If you're working with a little air can this big, you're going to be definitely needing a good upgrade. So I prefer those, hardware store type air compressors. 5 gallon, in my opinion, is the minimum for a good air compressor. And like I stated before, those air compressors give you more control over the air, much more volume of air, more duration of air. They're cheaper than those little crappy hobby grade, glorified air bubblers. And on top of that, you could use it for other things, not just plastic models. You could use it to fill up car tires, bike tires, pool toys, whatever, what have you. If you had some sort of a need for compressed air, those air compressors are good to go, and they are excellent. Working outdoors, obviously I can't lug that giant thing out here because I'm dealing with a 30-gallon stand-up unit. But fortunately, I have a really, really long air hose for this exact same type of purpose, and I just plug it in, and I'm good to go. For my PSI, I tend to go with a high volume of air. A lot of people are surprised exactly how much PSI I used to paint my models with. I'm rolling anywhere between 40 or 60. So, those little 5 PSI or 10 PSI max compressors, again, extremely anemic in my opinion. But, obviously I have a good thing going because I've been, cranking out models now for a long time with this setup. So, from here, I'm going to go ahead, put my mask on because I don't want to breathe in any of the vapors, and I'm going to go ahead and get this thing painted with its base coat. One common question I get in regards to painting is exactly how do you go about doing it? You know, outside of the airbrush and all that. Well, one of the most important techniques that I can't stress enough is to let it dry, or as I like to say around the shop, LID. This is true for things like adhesives, putties, and most importantly true for paints. If you'll notice, I only have the lower extremities painted at this time. Well, this actually was done on purpose. You go ahead and you airbrush a certain section of the model, and you go ahead and let that paint dry. Once it's fully set, you can then not only hold it in a different orientation without getting paint on your hands so much, but this will also prevent any sort of problems with the paint dripping or causing any other type of issues. With the paint applied, obviously now I can focus on the remainder of the surfaces. Another thing that I want to mention is that when I'm airbrushing, I usually start at the nooks and the crannies first, and then I just bleed out from there with the paint. This is true for places under here on the under portion of the sponsons. It's definitely true for back here on the engine hatch, or I should say the engine deck area, or the rear hull area, but it's definitely going to be true when I get up here too, on the actual engine deck. And actually what you're looking at here are two coats. I went ahead and applied the paint on the lower hull, as you just saw in the clip. Then I set the model aside and worked on the wheels. Well, from the time until after I was done with the wheels and when I got back to it, the paint was mostly dry on the majority of the surfaces, and this is partially thanks to the warm weather that we have. Once I had the model back in hand, I quickly went here and re-airbrushed some of the areas on these extremities, which are really tricky to get normally. And excuse me, a big common problem that you can have is you're painting the whole model. So you paint, you know, this flat areas, then you start going into the nooks and crannies, and then you revisit areas that you see missed sections on. That is how you cause problems, because what's happening is that paint that you applied, it's wet, and now you're adding more volume on top of it, which means now you have an excess amount and it's going to start dripping. And that is where these problems occur. The drips then can even puddle up into areas. Now you have thick, chunky, you know, blobs of paint. These are all things you want to not have on your build, and it's what separates a good paint job from one that is not so much. So now that you've seen exactly how I tackle these areas, let me go ahead, mask back up, get the airbrush loaded up, and complete the remainder of the base work. Oh, but before I do, you'll also notice that the wheels have been flipped over, and I'm going to paint the reverse sides. Just like with the suspension, the wheels are another thing that you want to paint one side at a time, specifically if they are in the built format like you have here. When they're on the sprues, you do have a little bit more leeway because you can just hang up the sprue and it'll be good to go. But when you're dealing with wheels that are assembled like this one over here, it's best to paint it, let it dry, then you can flip it and give it another coat of paint on the reverse section. Obviously, after the base coat is done, it's then time to apply the camouflage pattern. I went ahead and took care of that off screen, but you get a little glimpse of it right here on the road wheels. Also, what was taken care of is the weathering. This was done with washes and several other types of techniques that I've touched upon in other OTR videos. But then it comes time that once that's out of the way, to do the #1 task that I dread on every one of these German tanks, specifically ones with the interwoven wheels, and that is, it's time to paint the rubber tires. This is definitely the most tedious task on every single German World War II tank, specifically the cool ones, Panthers, Tigers, Jagdpanthers, and so forth. This job over here is always the one that it's like, it's definitely eating your vegetables. Not saying it doesn't look great when it's done, or that it's enjoyable when you're doing it, but it's definitely one of the more tedious things because of all the repetition. And it's now time on this build in order to take care of that. On my builds, I like to paint everything by hand, and it's all done via the paintbrush. There are several solutions out there. For instance, one that comes to mind was a masking product called Quick Wheel, which you would take the wheel, you would spray paint the wheel black, and then you would stick it into this little mask over here, and then you could airbrush the camo and all that. And then when you pop it off, the wheel or the tire is painted. I've actually utilized that product on a Tiger 1 build, or a couple Tiger 1 builds in the past 135. It worked pretty good. It was okay, but it does have some limitations to it. Number one is that you can only use it so many times, and two, you have to buy one basically for every type of vehicle. There's no one size fits all. So really, at the end of the day, in my opinion, it's just, we're just, you know, bucking up and doing the road wheel work by hand the old-fashioned way. Of course, this is another reason why I cannot stress enough why it's super duper important not to glue the wheels onto the tank before it is painted. It's a pain in the ass on most other type of tanks, but on a German interwoven wheel tank, good freaking luck trying to paint these tires. Or even just the wheels and the track for that matter, because I've seen people glue the track on the wheels before the thing even has a drop of paint. That's completely ridiculous. It's ludicrous to think that that's somehow a feasible idea, and I just want to warn everyone right now, iceberg, dead ahead, don't do that. So, with that little tirade out of the way, as for painting the tires, this is done just again by hand. I have my paintbrush right over here. And when it comes to the tire work, you don't want to use a paintbrush that's super tiny. It's just going to take longer to do unless the job needs it, i.e. if you're working on a vehicle with really, really small road wheels, perhaps the smaller brush might be the way to go, specifically on the rim sections, just to prevent any of the paint from bleeding into areas where it doesn't belong. For the paint itself, I'm utilizing Tamiya acrylic, and the color I have right here is just NATO black. You can utilize flat black, and for a while I also used Tamiya rubber black. In fact, I want to do so again. The reason why I'm not using it for this build is simply put, I ran out, and I need to buy some more. But the NATO black here is a good alternative and gives you a color that's very similar to that. Flat black will also work, but again, flat black is a little bit too black in my opinion. If you ever looked at aged rubber, it's not really that dark in color. Sometimes it has like a more of a chalky white appearance to it, and this color is better replicated in my opinion on the other colors I mentioned, namely the Tamiya rubber black and also the NATO black that we have here. For applying the paint, this is where the tediousness comes from. You can't just do the entire wheel through and through in one inning and call it a day. That's just sadly not the way it works. The way I like to do it is again in layers. So basically what I do is I start with the inner wheels on one tire, then I set it aside, and I do the exact same procedure on every other corresponding tire. On the inner row wheel over here, I do the same thing but on the reverse side. Once the paint fully sets, I then go ahead and I paint the inner portion on the opposite side. On my models, I like to thoroughly paint all areas of the tires which would be rubber. This would include the inner sections, the outer sections, and even the reverse sections. Before someone comments that that's crazy, you're not going to see that, the answer is yes, you will. Guys, I've made enough mistakes in the past, I've built enough models, and I've taken enough shortcuts to know what works and what doesn't work, hence the reason why I have the OTR lineup. And I can tell you for a fact, you will have areas that you will view the model in certain light or a certain angle, and you will see the areas unpainted, and it'll just stick out like a sore thumb. It happens every single time, which, by the way, is another reason why I tell you to paint the wheels before you install them to the vehicle. Fortunately, the paint dries pretty quickly, so by the time you're done with all of the road wheels, with painting one side, the ones that you set aside are now basically dry, and then you could continue the setup. So within about like 30 minutes to an hour or so, you should have all of the surfaces painted. As you can see, there are only 2 wheels left. I just wanted to briefly describe how I personally apply the paint so you get to see the technique in hand. So as you can see, the paint is really low. It's practically on the bottom, which is perfect for paint application like this. You just want to make sure it's nice and mixed once the brush is loaded up. The way I do it is I just hold the wheel in my hand and I apply the paint. Some individuals like to put the road wheel on a stick and they could pivot it. This does work. The problem is it has limiting factors. One, it's slower than actually painting it by hand because you have to actually stick the thing on, spin it, and then you have to pluck it off and put it down. And sometimes the wheel, you need to get areas where it won't stick and it'll fall off. And again, it actually causes more problems sometimes than benefits. The other thing is you cannot paint the other surfaces right away because obviously you need to hold the wheel. And if you are touching wet paint, you can clearly see how that can cascade into a mess very quickly. So the best way to do it is just the way I'm going to show it here. Now, when I'm painting, you want to keep the paint away from the rim, if this thing can get in focus, right there on the inner portion. And this is going to be true for all surface areas. The rim is obviously metal, and there's no rubber on that section over there, so you want to avoid getting paint on that at all costs. This is what separates a good build from a build that is built more or less by a novice. One way to do this is to have a very steady hand. And what I like to do is I like to take my 2 pinkies and I just bridge them like that, or my ring finger over there and my other pinky, and you'll see that this actually acts as support and allows me to have a steady platform on which to add the paint. Once you apply the paint, you just basically go through this format that we have right here. And slowly but surely, you can see how the paint gets applied to these surfaces. Once the brush runs out of paint, obviously you just want to top it off. One thing about that rim is that it just acts as a guide sometimes, and the brush will just line up against it. Now, if you go over the rim, not a problem. Just smear it off with your finger like I did just there. Back it off a couple paces and then reapply. And there you go. The inner portion is painted. Theoretically, at this point here, I can also paint this section. And again, I just want to use the exact same techniques that I touched upon before. This is why, by the way, I'm using the size of paintbrush that I'm using right now. If the brush was thinner, it would only paint the area immediately next to the rim, and then I would have to take a second pass. With the broader brush, it takes care of that in one fell swoop. So there's one of the tires painted. I'm going to set him aside. Now I'm going to do the exact same paint work on the inner road wheel, and I like to start on the back portion here. Oop. If you get a little drop. And by the way, paint consistency here is going to be paramount. If it's too runny, it's just going to puddle up in areas where you really don't want it, and it's just going to go over the rim into the fasteners, and it's going to gum up the works and ruin your day, which is something you definitely don't want to happen, specifically after you pumped all the time into the paint work and prep work as I did. Obviously, if the paint's too thick and chunky, that's not doing you any favors either. You just gotta thoroughly mix the paint properly, which is a no-brainer of sorts. And there we go. Okay, so this guy here is all set. I'm going to set him aside. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the next tire on, or the next area on all of these tires here. I already painted the inner portion of this one. I'm going to swing over and paint the inner portion of this one. Not really going to get this on camera because obviously it's going to make the video much longer than it really needs to be. And you kind of get the drift on how I apply the paint to these sections. All these German tanks, the Panther isn't too bad. I think the worst, if I had to put my money on it, would be an early production Tiger one. That thing just has oodles of wheels. I think there's, what, like 40 or 60, I think? I don't know, it's been a while since I worked on an early production Tiger, but needless to say, there are a lot of rubber tire surfaces that need to be painted on one of those. So much so that even the Germans themselves are like, yeah, we're using too much rubber, let's not do that. Okay, so now that you see that the tire was painted, I'm also going to paint this side too. That's all there is to it. Just rinse, wash, and repeat. So once the rims are painted on either side of the inner wheels, with the paintbrush held like this, I basically just go ahead and I apply it to the extra surfaces that the paint would have missed. Generally, when you're painting the rims, the paint tends to overflop onto the side sections, painting the inner areas, and that's what happens with the main road wheels. On this one over here, in order to paint that, remember, you can't exactly hold it, so what I like to do is I like to just pinch it like this, and I paint it in that format. The trick, though, is then to carefully pinch it again with your other hand on the metallic rim area, and then just set it onto the table in that format. It sounds a bit sketchy, but it's actually pretty easily done. On this wheel over here, I think this is the, nope, this is the second to the last wheel that needs to be painted. So I'll just quickly take care of that right now. And then you'll see exactly how the rims, or I should say how the edges of the tire are painted basically just on their own by going up and down the outer surfaces that we have right here. And as you can see, it pretty much thoroughly coated the section on the face. Sometimes there may be a gap or two, and if that happens, obviously just a little drop of paint is all that's needed to make sure that the surfaces are thoroughly painted. And then once they are thoroughly painted, it is then going to be time to secure them to the model, which I'll be panning over to momentarily. Once the wheels are done, it's then time to do the rubber sections that are found on the hull, and this is something that almost everyone out there forgets to do. On the Panther, there are several sections on the sidewalls that are actually rubber, namely the bump stops that are found right here on the rear, the front, the other one here on the front, and also, most importantly, on the Panther, that little extra wheel that's right there on the final drive. In order to paint these, the same paint is going to be utilized, but you'll notice that I use a much smaller paintbrush, just because it makes getting into these tighter confines here much, much more easily done. And again, I can't stress this enough, if you're the type of person that builds the wheels and then glues them on before the tank is painted, good freaking luck trying to paint that wheel like I just did. Make sure the rims are painted. Okay, so once the wheel is painted, like I stated before, the bump stops are rubber as well. And just some swipes of paint are really all that's needed. Like so. When I was a kid, I wasn't sure if these were springs or if they were, some kind of a material, but as it turns out, they are indeed made from rubber. In fact, on my 1/6 scale counterparts, I generally make these in molded rubber for reasons of, well, detail and accuracy. And once fully painted, you're then ready to start with the wheel installation. But before I do that, I'm just going to go ahead and take care of the wheels on the opposite side. Once everything is painted, it's then time to fit the wheels on in place. And this is something that I always mention in these videos for a very good reason. With the wheels and the tank now fully painted, there are some layers of paint that are going to be built up on both the surfaces of the swing arm axles as well as the center portion here of the road wheels. And why this is extremely relevant is because when it comes time to install the road wheels, let's just take this one here, for example, that still has all of its paint on it. If I take the wheel and try to insert it in place, you're going to see it's a very tight, snug fit. If you try to manhandle and just push the thing all the way through, this is going to lead to issues. First, it's going to potentially lead to an alignment issue because the wheel isn't going to be set in fully. And more importantly, this will most definitely lead to issues because the plastic on the axle or the swing arm itself will snap. And if that happens at this stage in the game, you now have just opened up Pandora's box, and it's going to be a repair disaster. So neither of which of those scenarios is beneficial, and it's something you want to avoid at all costs. Fortunately, taking care of the problem is very easy. What I'm doing over here is I have a drill bit that's the exact same size of the axle. It's probably the same one I touched upon before earlier in this video. And I'm just going to mount it here on my pin vise. I'm going to take my road wheel, insert it in place, and just spin it. That's all. What I'm doing here is I'm opening up the tolerances on the portion of the wheel that make contact with the axle. And once the tolerances are opened up to a certain point, the wheel could then be inserted in place. As you see, it went right on. However, in my opinion, it's still a little snug, so I'm going to just continue the trick just for a little while longer until I am happy with the way the part gets installed in place. Perfect. Another trick you can do, that's also one I'm probably going to do myself, is with an X-Acto blade. Just scrape off the paint on certain sections of the axle. This too will have the benefit of reducing the material found on these areas over here, which will in turn make for an easier installation. Both techniques are viable. Both will get you to the exact same result, and both are absolutely important if you want to have your build go by in a much easy and a, well, stress-free manner. Here you can see what the tank looks like with the wheels secured to one side of the model. And now all that remains is me to add them to the other side. As you can see, I went ahead and scraped off the paint off of the swing arms for the reasons that I just touched upon. Usually when you build a Panther or any other interwoven type tank kit, it's always best to install the wheels on in layers. It does simplify the wheel installation immensely. However, if for one reason or another that's just not an opportunity for you to have, like for instance with this example over here where it's a rebuild, well, rest assured there's still another way to put the wheels on. There's a little trick, and I touched upon it in the other Jagdpanther OTR video, and it's basically going to be the same type of trick here. What you need to do is you need to kind of install them on in a wedge type format, where you start in the front and then you work your way rearward. You can do it in reverse, but I always tend to like starting from the front and move my way back. It just seems to me to just work out better that way. So the next thing you need to know is the actual orientation of the wheels, and this is something that's easily done by, of course, looking at the instructions. If not, you've already done enough German tanks like I have. It's basically second nature. But this is important because once the wheels go on and once you have the glue in place, you know, you're not going to be able to take them off anymore. So you definitely don't want to screw this up. On the Panther here, the inner wheel is first and the double spaced out wheel, or the outer wheel as I refer to them, is last. And to do this, the first thing I'm going to start is actually with the outer wheels. Because they have that inner wheel here that goes on the inner row, you kind of need to index that first. So I'm just going to line it up. And when I put the wheels on, I just prop them on the very edge of the swing arm. So it's just enough meat to hold the wheel on in place like that. From there, I could go ahead and take the inner wheel and just guide it in ever so slightly and place him in position. And then I just basically repeat this until the wheels just start lining up, as you can see. As you move towards the rear, you may want to push the ones in the front in a little bit more, so it creates that little wedge type effect so that the wheels just flow in this way. Otherwise, if you have them all dangling on the edge, what will happen is if you shake the model, they'll all just tumble off on you and you have to, you know, start from square one. So just line them up and then they just go where they need to go. Sometimes the last wheel tends to give you a little bit of a fight, but what you do is you just loosen the other one slightly. This will open up the tolerance for you to then install the last one like I did there. Now on the Panther, and same is true for the Tiger, with the way the orientation is of the direction of the torsion bars, the one here on this side, the idler is always closer to the inner portion of the wheel. So again, you want to install it at this time. On the idler, really quick, you'll see that I went ahead and painted the rims steel as they would be on the real vehicle. And this was just painted much along the same lines as I did with the rubber, but obviously I use silver paint. The idlers have poly caps in them, so you don't have to worry about them falling out. And then you just go ahead and line up the wheels appropriately. You want to seat them in fully so that they line up nicely. Obviously, if you pay attention to this, this is going to help immensely with the installation of the track. So now that the wheels are installed, you can see that they have a rolling nature to them, but this is something that's going to have to be solidified because once the track goes on, I need to glue the top portion of the track to the wheels in order to get the look of the track sag. Which as a kid was something that I couldn't bring myself to do because, you know, I was used to these Tamiya tanks having working road wheels on them, and the fact, or the idea of gluing them was just, you know, blasphemous to me. But all these years later, I'm going to do exactly that. To secure the road wheels in place, I'm going to use very thin super glue. Now, the applicator I'm going to use is not going to be the applicator head because, well, kind of wore out, which is quite common with these things, but luckily there's another way to do it, and it's going to be done with a stick. It's just a piece of strip styrene, and I'm going to take the strip styrene and use it as an applicator. So I'm going to dip it into the glue and then just carefully put it right over there where the axle meets the wheel. This is the really thin stuff where it's like water, so just a little drop is all you need in the right location to secure it in place. You don't want too much, just a small little drop. Sometimes the applicator is a hit and miss, but it usually gets the job done. One thing I want to mention is that when I am applying the glue, I'm actually putting pressure with my hand to force the wheel as close to the swing arm as possible. This is, again, to ensure proper alignment. Because once you cross this threshold here, there is no going back. If you get a little drop or two on the swing arm itself, and you see a little shiny spot, rest assured it's not a problem. Once the model is fully coated with the varnish, this will go away. But the other thing to keep in mind is that on the real swing arms, this here would all be leaky with oil and other sorts of lubricants, so having a little shiny spot is actually not necessarily a bad thing. You just continue application of the glue. Once you're all done, once the glue fully sets, the wheels will be rock solid, as you can see. And at this point here, it's ready for the road, or I should say the track and the sprockets. You notice that the sprockets have not been affixed to the model at this time, and that's because the way these single piece tracks are, I always, and also the workable tracks too for that matter, I like to install the tracks while they are coiled up around or timed with the sprocket, so then I could just loop them in this type of manner. Let me go ahead and finish up the weathering on the track, and then I could continue with the remainder of the installation. But you can already see how everything's really coming to shape very nicely. And obviously once the wheels are done, it's then time to secure on the track. The track on these German tanks need to have the top portions glued to the top sections of the road wheels in order to simulate the slack that we have here. This is something that is more or less optional if you do not have the capabilities or the tools on hand in order to pull this technique off. You could just mount it in place, although admittedly is going to hurt the look of the model as opposed to something with the natural sag that you see here. Since the track on this side is installed, I might as well take you all along to show you how the installation goes with the one on the opposite side. What I like to do is I like to put some bubble wrap down, and I can lean the model on that. It just protects the paint job and prevents some unneeded damage. I then take the track, which at this point has been thoroughly painted and weathered, and I'm going to go ahead and begin the installation. The first thing I'm going to do is going to take the sprocket and line it up and time it to the appropriate location. However, before I do, I want to figure out where the bands actually connect. because you have some options on how to conceal this location on your model. On the Panther over here, you can hide it on the bottom, where it gets sucked up by the interwoven wheels, or you can hide it on the top. You can hide it on the top. This is something that can hide it. However, it is a little bit more visible. But if you're going to add the side skirts on, obviously this will conceal the track joint sections immensely. For this one here, I'm going to reinstall the tin work, so we'll see exactly how that pans out as I proceed. The next thing I want to do is to make sure that the orientation on the track is correct. The Panther looks like it has a symmetrical thread pattern, but that's not the case. From all the examples I've seen the two little scoops that are found on these two ends of the grousers pointing in the up direction, so I'm going to go ahead and position it in that manner. So here's the joining point right here, and then basically I'm just going to line up the sprocket accordingly. I want to make sure that the teeth all time their appropriate location. Obviously, it's a Tamiya model with Tamiya track, so that shouldn't be an issue. Once it's timed, I'm going to start with the installation. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go from the rear and move my way to the front. You want to make sure that the teeth are in the center portion when they get fitted onto the idler. And what I mean by that is that the wheel hugs this area between the teeth. Sometimes the teeth may bend in on itself, and it may take a little fiddling to get the idler on appropriately, but that is something you do need to be aware of. And it looks like I got that on correctly. Let's see the opposite side. And yep, okay, so the teeth are on correctly. Now I'm going to just snake it in. Sometimes the first wheel here can be a little bit of a trick with trying to get the piece on, where it could fight you, but this side here wasn't too bad. That was more or less the thing that I ran into on this side. Again, with the way these interwoven tanks are, the idler on one side is going to be a little bit easier, and the sprocket on the other side is going to be a little bit easier. But again, that's more or less due to the orientation of those swing arms. Okay, so the other thing that you just saw me do is to line up the center portion of the guides in between the thinner portions of the teeth, or I should say of the wheels. And it's fitting on in place very nicely. And now I could go ahead and just press the sprocket on all the way. This point here, you can see that the track is mounted in place. As I touched upon before, you can leave the track in this manner if you don't have the techniques or the tools to go ahead and glue it to the top portions of the wheels. But again, this is going to potentially hurt the look of the model. If we compare that to the one on the opposite side, you can see what I'm referring to. So to get the look of the sag, what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue the wheels to the track. And this is again done with the thin super glue. And I'm going to use an applicator. In this occasion, I'm going to be using a piece of wire. The plastic would work just fine, but I'm just going to use a wire for this one. For the procedure, I like to start from the last row wheel and move my way up to the front. Basically, I add a drop of glue on the top portion of each of the row wheels. On the ones in the middle, you don't have to necessarily add the glue to the wheels. You can just add to the ones in the center. But, you know, it just depends on how thorough you want to go with it. The most important ones are the ones in the rear and the ones in the front. The one in the rear, you want to try to get the glue on the back section. Also, to prevent the track from bending like this, where if you glue it on the front portion here, the tension's going to want to yank it a little bit like that on the rear. It's not something that's a deal breaker or anything, but it's one of those things that tends to just like bug me when I see it. So I always try to take care of that. So I'm going to go ahead, dip the wire in the glue, and just drop it right on top of these two sections. Once done, with a screwdriver, I just go ahead and compress it down like that. The thin CA dries very, very quickly, and they have this thing where if you use less of it, it'll dry faster than if you use a lot, but that's just something, you know, you want to factor in when you're doing one of these. After about, 10 or 15 seconds or so, the piece should stay in place, which it is, and then I can continue with the procedure. And I'm going to add it to the top portion here. And I'll also add it to this one too. Another trick is to take some cardboard, wedge it into this section over here, and you can cover more than one wheel in one shot. There is a YouTube tutorial where an individual does a technique similar to this on a Panther, but his is a Panther, and he uses aluminum foil crumpled up into little balls to basically act as a jig. That technique will also work too. It's a good technique. The only the only critique I have of that video is he's doing all that before the tank is painted, and I just went on a whole diatribe on exactly why that's not a good idea. But the technique itself of securing the track to the wheels is a pretty sound one. If the track pries up over the wheel, no biggie, just try it again. And I'm also going to add a little bit more to this guy over here. A lot of times the glue might not necessarily be applied on an even manner, so there's only just a little bit amount on there, and that can potentially cause the wheel to pop up. I just play the weighting game. You just pinch it on there. You don't want to blow on it too much because that can actually accelerate the gas effect that super glue has when it sets. So if you just let it dry naturally, that will mitigate some of that. At this point, by the way, the tank is not varnished. This is something that I have done alternatively, where I'll build the model without the track fitted in place, varnish it, and then add the track. Or, in this case over here, I'm building the model with the track, and I am going to varnish it afterwards. The VMS matte varnish that I'm going to use, haven't seen it having any sort of problems with the flexible tracks, but keep in mind one thing about this tank, or vehicle I should say, is that it's going to have the side skirts on, so the varnish isn't really going to get a chance to really have all that much contact with the track bands itself. I have in the past had experiences where there was a little bit of gas remaining on the surfaces where the glue set, and then I just take with a paintbrush some of the VMS matte varnish and just touch it up in those areas over there, and it does a great job with concealing the CA gas, deleting it basically from visible view. Alright, so that's been taken care of. So the next one is probably the trickiest, and that's the one here on the front. Just like with the one on the back, you want to apply the glue to the front and rear portion of the row wheel tops. And this is something that sometimes is a little bit tricky, specifically when you have to get in there in between those teeth. And this is why an applicator stick here is actually really, really handy. So I'm going to go ahead and try to fish this in here. Sometimes you'll hit the track and it'll knock the glue off. And then you won't be able to get the piece fitted in place. But once the glue is applied, you then just do this and you play the waiting game. And once the glue is fully set, you really get to see what it looks like with the track sag effect present. At this point here, you can leave the model in this configuration with the wheels exposed, or you can add the side tin work like the way this model had originally when I first built it. So, you know, that's up to the builder's discretion. For this example, I am going to remount on the tin work for the simple fact that the tank, or I should say the model, I keep calling it a tank, the model had the tin work on originally when I first built the model, and for this one here, I want to emulate the box art, so I'm going to go ahead and remount on the tin work. The tin work has already been painted and weathered to match the remainder of the vehicle, so those pieces are just going to get fitted in place. And after all of that work, here's the model now finally completed. Let's go ahead and take a really quick walk around this model. Starting with the road wheels takes us to some of the extra added weathering that I was alluding to in the previous scene. Since that scene was recorded, you can see the oily, sweaty residue type effects that I generally add to my models. On the real vehicles, the seals would not last very long, so it wouldn't be too uncommon to see a vehicle in this type of configuration. Also, even when the seals are new, you tend to also see a little bit of sweating going on. If you don't believe me, take a look at a real piece of heavy equipment and get back to me. On the weathering itself, this has to have been done after that previous scene because when that scene was filmed, I still had to go and add a little bit of varnish work to the side of the model. Obviously, with these pieces, or I should say with these effects being done with gloss, applying them prior to the varnish coat is not really beneficial. So once the varnish is added, I went ahead and brushed on the effects in the various locations that you see here. In addition to adding on the clear sections, you can see I also added the red Zerk fittings, which is a prominent bit of detailing found on these German tanks. This is not just true for the Panther, but basically found also on the Tiger one, as well as the King Tiger. As I often mention on these techniques, this is the type of thing where you want to think about it as like seasoning on your food. You don't want to do every single wheel with the same exact type of weathering or with the same number of streaks and vice versa, because this will just have the effect of being overdone. You got to basically, use your head and you have to use your imagination. Maybe some seals are still good, so they don't have any leakage whatsoever. Some are beginning to sweat, and others just worn out and they're, dripping left and right, here and there. So when you have this type of a mindset, this is a way to give the model just a little bit of extra personality, and it's also a way to prevent it from being, just too repetitive. If you have every wheel with the same type of weathering on it in the same locations, you're not really doing yourself any favors. So if you want to do a technique like this, try to get into the habit of being more random with the type of streaks and with the length of the streaks that you can add to the wheels over here. Obviously, this technique is not just true for the Panther, but it's true for many other types of vehicles and also in other scales as well. Moving up takes us to the side skirts, and this is something that I'm still even torn on now. I really love the suspension on the Panther. It's probably the coolest part, and when you put the side skirts on, you do kind of, eliminate that really aesthetically pleasing detailing. However, for this build over here, I really want it to look like the box art, so I went ahead and added it with the side skirts. Don't be surprised if I get another one of these painted the exact same way and leave it skirtless, just because, it's like having your cake and eating it too. But again, for this build over here, I wanted to keep it with the skirts because really, I don't have that many Panthers in my collection that are skirted. Of course, some people out there are going to say, yeah, but John, if you want to see the suspension and have the skirts, you can go ahead and model one or two of the panels missing. And that's not really for me. Usually when I do a build, I either go all or nothing. So, it's good to have, a few builds in your collection with the skirts, just so, it breaks up the monotony and you don't have too much of a myopic collection. And again, with the availability and cost of these tanks, or I should say these kits over here, it couldn't be too hard to snatch up another one of these Tamiya Jagdpanthers, build it basically in the configuration that I just stated. But that's, I guess, something for another video for another day. Hopping back down takes to the tracks, and I've stated several times in this video already, the tracks found on this kit here are excellent. In fact, the Tamiya kits from this era are some of my favorite because the tracks on them were really that good. Everything you ever want in a 1/35 scale track are found on these ones here in abundance. They have excellent surface detailing on them, the flexibility is great, they paint even better, and they secure onto the model with hardly any problems. They are just excellent in every known metric, which is why it is a travesty and a sheer shame that Tamiya are moving away from these patterns of tracks here in order to give us the lovely individual Lincoln lengths, which are just pure garbage. Don't care what anyone says, they're garbage. To me, if you're watching this video, seriously, get your stuff together and give us tracks that don't suck, okay? We're paying good prices for these kits. The least you could do is save us an extra 20 bucks by giving us tracks that aren't complete trash. With the mini tirade out of the way, it's back to the model's details. Moving in, you can see the rear hull details. One thing I do want to point out is that on the rear taillight over here, usually I paint them blue. However, I've seen some evidence lately stating that that's actually a mistake. And instead of the two being blue, they are green. So for this one here, I went ahead and painted it with the green color that you see. This is, I believe, Tester's enamel, just green paint I had on hand, brushed in the proper location. It's nice and glossy when done, and so it's a good candidate for use on a model like this. As for which one to use, blue or green, honestly, I'm just as confused as you at this point, so just try to find as many real pictures of the real vehicles as possible and just, you know, shoot from there is the best thing I can say. But for this one here, I went with the green color for the tubular taillight. As for the reflector, this is still red, and you can see it right over there. Just a little drop of gloss red paint is all that's required to make that piece shine. Also, with the camera in this angle, you get to see the added detailing of those fasteners that I mentioned before on the exhaust manifolds. Gives it just a little bit of extra spice. And you can see some other extra details that I forgot to mention earlier, which are the U-shackles. The U-shackles were a mess on this model. Some were, I believe, salvaged, others weren't. And what I went ahead and did was I made a mold of the U-shackles found on that other Tamiya runner, just because I tend to need them a lot, and they tend to easily get broken whenever you fit them in place. So this is something that's good to have a mold of, so I can cast as many as I need. On this one here, I believe most of them are actually resin, if I'm not mistaken. Regardless, since they are a direct copy of the Tamiya ones, once they paint and weather up, they just get dropped into their appropriate locations, and they blend in with the remainder of the detailing on the model. Moving to the front takes to the bow MG, this is the original kit supply one, and it survived everything from the original build to sitting on a shelf for 20-something years to the denatured alcohol bath, and yes, even the final and paint job. So this little guy here is a trooper, and he was simply just painted, weathered, and mounted to the appropriate location that you see here. The one thing that I didn't do was drill him out, which is something that I generally mention. I didn't have a bit on hand that was tiny enough in order to properly do the job. So as I frequently mention, if you don't have the tools to do it, you best just sit it out and just leave it stock, as opposed to trying to drill the thing out and ruining it. So after the ordeal this thing had, I think it earned its place back on the model at hand. If, however, you are working on one of these builds and you want to swap this out, there are several aftermarket components out there that are made out of turned brass, which are, you know, admittedly far more detailed compared to the stock one, but this is something that for this build, I just didn't think was necessary. But if you are one of those people out there, I believe Edward or Aber, or probably both, there's a few companies that offer that, will have this detailing ready for you. Moving along, it takes, well, the Bosch, like that survived miraculously, as well as the Pioneer tools. The Pioneer tools are the original kit supply ones. They were just simply cleaned up and then remounted into place once everything was repainted. The same is also true for the opposite side, which, thanks to the magic of editing, everything can be seen in better light. So all of the components were simply just remounted to the exact same locations, and there were really no other problems to be mentioned. For the jack block here, rather than going with the approach I did originally, where I wanted to look like it was painted with the base coat, for this one here, I just went traditional with it, and I just painted it with the wood color, as well as with the black metal straps, which is generally how you see these components when fitted to the vehicles. One bit of the Pioneer tool detailing that I did not remove during the build was with the front tow cable claws. These pieces were glued on so well that in order to remove them, it would have caused unnecessary amount of damage, so I didn't see the harm with just leaving them on the model and just working around it, and that's exactly what I did. The units stayed on these locations throughout the entire duration of the rebuild, and basically they were just painted with the remainder of the model, with both the terms of the base coat, the camouflage, and the weathering. The way you see it was basically how it turned out. The units, though, were specifically weathered carefully in order to make them look a little bit more worn, so it looks like they were actually used. However, the paint on them, you see, is the paintwork that you see on the remainder of the vehicle. It's just a way to give, just again, a little bit of extra character to your build if you do one or two items in this type of format. With the camera readjusted, you get a better view of the tracks now fitted to their stored locations. As I mentioned before, these are the HD 3D printed components from ECA, and they secure onto the vehicle as the original kit ones did, and you can see that the kit supply spare tracks also slide on to their appropriate locations. One thing that I do want to mention is that the ECA racks do have longer arms on them, so the tracks are mounted in place in a much more secured way compared to the original Tamiya ones. If I go ahead and move the camera, you can see exactly how much longer the little track retention clips are, and they fully encompass the link via the hinge. Also, you can probably see the spot welds in those locations I was touching upon before, and just it's an extra way to give just that much extra accuracy to your build. Same is true, needless to say, on the opposite side. Moving upward takes to the rear engine deck, and here you get to see what the details now look like all fully completed. We have the ECA HD 3D printed hooks that I touched upon before, and as always, they are a huge focal point on the back portion here of these Panther pattern vehicles. The Tamiya kit are emitting these little fittings over here, and once added, it really does complete the look. Also, you get to see the addition of the Edward PE, found in the various locations. As I touched upon before, they also are a nice addition to basically every Panther model. The one recommendation or wish I have out there is I wish someone just sold just the round sections for a Panther G with the mesh covers without the sliders in place, because I always do this on a build. I install the PE, then I feel guilty leaving the sliders off, and next thing you know, I have all of my Panthers with sliders on them. So this is something that I personally am going to have to start trying to move away from on future Panther builds, but for this one here, it works perfectly fine. As always, they do add just a bit of extra uniqueness to the build when you have them fitted in place. I'm sure some Panther aficionados out there is going to be like, John, you're only supposed to have 2 of them in place. There's never really 4, or people debate that back and forth. But for this one here, I went ahead and used all 4 just because, well, I kind of like the way they look. But regardless, yeah, on future Panther builds, I am definitely going to try to restrict myself from going the full Monty like you see here. But for this one here, it's totally fine. Also, as I frequently mention, on the rear section of the Panther and the King Tiger as well, this here is actually your fuel filler spout. And I always go ahead and render it with the spilt fuel and fluid type weathering feature like you see here. It's just an extra way to give a little bit extra kick to your model. Moving along takes to the antenna base. This is the ECA HD 3D print one that I mentioned before. And also, like I mentioned before, I went ahead and drilled it out in order to install a metal wire. Just like on every one of my German tank videos, the composition of the antenna base is made from rubber, so it's painted with Tamiya rubber black. The antenna base itself, or I should say the antenna wire itself, is black. However, the midsection here would be a brass coloring, so I went ahead and painted with a little swipe of gold paint that you see here, and it's a great way to add just that much more extra accuracy and color pop to your build, without, again, causing that much extra work. One other thing I want to mention is that the rear hatch is actually still functional. However, when I tried to open it here, it looks like it was kind of glued shut with the varnish, and I'm not going to mess with it. There's no real interior detailing to mention. We all saw what it looked like on the inside before, and I didn't really do anything special with the paintwork. So, yes, it is functional. Yes, I could probably pop it with an X-Acto knife. No, I'm not going to do it on camera because, it's irrelevant. So, let's just go ahead and carry on. And carrying along takes to the top roof. As I touched upon before, the periscopes on this build were one of the areas I really wanted to focus on because I botched them up so miserably when I did the model the first time around. And here you get to see what they look like now, fully repaired. The periscopes are properly painted. This is something that I always want to stress, and it's an easy way to make your model pop because the detailing is literally supplied with the model. The only thing you have to do is just carefully paint them in order to just unlock the extra detailing that they give you. So the periscopes are painted in flat black, and the prism itself is painted in gloss black. Now, you do have several options for German AFE periscopes. Sometimes they use a black Bakelite, other times they use the red-brown Bakelite. Either material will work fine for your build. It just depends on personal choice and preference. Or if you're really cool, you can even do a mix and match thing, but that's not really needed to be mentioned for this particular project. Also, we have the optics found for the main 88. As I mentioned before, this was drilled out in order to give that lens feature that we have here. And here you see what it looks like now with the extra little swipe of gloss black added. The other optics are present right there. And they were painted in Dunkelgelb, which is another feature, or I should say another trick to do to give a little bit extra color pop to the build. The optics, I've seen them both in black or in Dunkelgelb, so whichever way makes you, feel aesthetically pleased, that's the way to go with on your build. The last thing I want to mention about the turret roof involves the panel lines as well as even the puzzle lines that we have here. As I mentioned before, when I first built the model, I went ahead and used a Dremel to added well detailing and cut line detailing to these areas. And although my heart was in the right place, the technique was just not really there for that. And this was something that I did address during the build. As we saw earlier, I went ahead and went up and down these lines here with a needle file, and it did a phenomenal job with cleaning everything out. It refined all of the tick marks, and some of the deeper tick marks are just still there. And they actually enhance the model because they actually act as, torch cut lines, but are more proper to scale compared to the way they were originally when I first did the task. So, in a way, again, my heart was in the right place. It just took an older version of me to just refine it all that much more. Regardless, the model now looks basically perfect in the current configuration. Moving forward takes to the mantle as well as the remainder of the 88. Needless to say, this was a bit of a surprise. I wasn't expecting to have to repair on this build. However, as I completed the repair, and as I mentioned before, it makes for a better build overall than it was done. Because of the repair work, I was thoroughly able to paint the rear section here of the mantlet housing. The mantlet now sits at the correct place on the model, and I was also able to thoroughly remove the seam line that was found on the barrel sections that, again, I touched upon earlier. Also, unlike before, now the unit sits prominently up, and it no longer needs any sort of magic blue pill in order to accomplish that task. And in addition, with the elevation issue resolved, the unit can still pivot left and right as it did originally when the kit was originally designed and when it was originally built with the kit supply parts. With the camera brought in closer, you get to really appreciate those cut lines that I touched upon before when I added them with the lathe. Also note the seam is completely and utterly blended away. And on the muzzle brake over here, you can see the other lines that I referenced earlier, and now that the model's fully painted, it just comes out in better focus. And that's all there is with the detailing, and this leads us to the paint and the markings. Obviously, for the paint work, like I mentioned before, I went with a green dominant German 3-tone camouflage pattern, and you basically saw me apply the base coat earlier on in the video. Like I mentioned before, I wanted this one to really emulate as close as possible the one on the box art, and with the way the washes and with the filters turned out, I more or less achieved the goal in mind. And whenever you can get the model to look as close as possible as the box art, that always makes you feel good, because the one on the box art is always awesome. Or at least generally speaking. If it has a proper box art, of course. And Tamiya, yeah, they usually never disappoint. The remainder of the paintwork was also done with a mix between the airbrush as well as the dry brushing techniques. The camouflage pattern, the filter, the wash, the counter shading, that's all done via the airbrush. The model did have Tamiya panel line accent used for several of the other detailing of weathering effects. And then the dry brushing technique was used in order to get the other chipped and scratch look, which you generally see on my builds. For the markings, these are actually Tamiya water slide decals. As for the source, well, they came from another Tamiya 1/35 scale 1990s second generation Jagdpanther kit that I built alongside this one, as I reference frequently in this video. Of course, that model will be the subject matter of its own model showcase video, believe that, and that's something that's going to come in the weeks that come after this video gets posted that you see here. So, stay tuned for that. Regardless, the Tamiya decals are always something that are just a joy to work with. They apply on very easily, they adhere to the model effortlessly, and they just work great with the VMS matte varnish. Once the decals are fully dried, the matte varnish was applied to the entire model, giving you for the result that you see here, which is something that never disappoints. As I always mention, the VMS matte varnish is highly recommended and is something that I utilize on my builds for basically the reasons that I just mentioned. As I touched upon several times in this video, this is the second generation of Tamiya Jagdpanther kit. Tamiya first released a Jagdpanther back in the early 1970s timeframe. And as fate turns out, I built one of those models many years ago in my youth, and if anyone's a fan of the channel, you probably see where I'm going with this. That model was also a featured cast member on the Old Tank Repair series. And well, since this is an Old Tank Repair video, and since this is a Tamiya Jagdpanther, I might as well go ahead and bring Gramps out. And here you can see the two Tamiya Jagdpanthers side by side. We have here Gen 1 and Gen 2. And yes, both of them again are Old Tank Repair alumni. This video, or I should say this model here, has its own OTR video dedicated just to that. And I recommend checking it out to see exactly how much work went into this one to bring it up to the condition that we have here, because if I'm not mistaken, this one actually required more work. But as you can see, totally worth it. Both these models are just a gem to have in my collection, and every minute I pumped into bringing them up to the condition that we have here is one that was definitely well enjoyed. It's also interesting to point out that if you compare and contrast the two kits side by side, you can really get into the mindset of what Tamiya was trying to accomplish back when they designed this kit all those years ago. This model here was basically the best that they can do with the available molding and casting technology that they had at the time, as well as also with the limited just reference materials that were also available during the same time frame. We jump forward to the 1990s, and you can really see just how much the design and molding technology improved during that time frame. In addition to that, you can also really see and appreciate just how much more reference materials were out there in order to make these kits that much more accurate compared to the way they were in the years past. However, it's also interesting to point out that the old school Tamiya Jagdpanther kit here is really more or less an amalgamation of an early and late pattern of Jagdpanther with the various details here and there. And although this kit is far from perfect, at the end of the day, if it's painted and weathered nicely, they'll still leave for a nice end result. One last thing I want to mention is that this kit here is a perfect example of just because a model may have really archaic or inaccurate tooling, that doesn't mean it can't be polished up into something that's a nice addition to add to your collection. And never let the age or simplicity of a tooling dictate whether or rather or not it can be turned into something nice. Well, at the end of the day, there's really nothing much more that can be said about this build. This model really blew my expectations out of the water with its final outcome. I couldn't be any happier in how it turned out. The model did require a bit more work than I originally anticipated when I first started the project. However, welcome to OTR life. And although this model here did need a little bit of extra work to polish it up to the condition that we have here, in the end, it's completely worth it. This model is basically in like new condition, and I could go ahead and put it up next to one of my other freshly built models, and if you didn't watch this video, you would have never guessed that this one here is an OTR alumni, which is basically the ultimate goal whenever I take one of these OTR projects. As I often mention in these videos, these plastic models are far more robust than a lot of individuals out there give them credit for. There is this myth out there where if you build a plastic model and let's just say it doesn't turn out all that right the first time, it's going to be doomed to stay in that format for the rest of the time because, well, they just never rebuild into something that would have been built properly in its original condition. And that is just purely not the case. These plastic models here can be brought right back up from the dead, and with a little bit of extra work and some extra love, you could go ahead and turn it from something that was a wreck to something that's now a showpiece in your collection. Another thing that I always mention in these videos is that every time I complete one of these OTR builds, there is a little bit of redemption that I feel every single time, and that is partially some of the motivational factors why I take these older builds on. Whenever you build a model, it doesn't come out all that right the first time. It does sting a little bit, knowing it's in the back of your head that, you botched it. And, whenever you finally get to it and correct the wrong, that's always something that feels just amazing afterwards. Also, to add on what I mentioned before, this was a fairly expensive model when I purchased it all those years ago. Even today, these models are still fairly on the, medium priced end, I should say. There are kits that are far more expensive than them now, but, back in the day when specifically you're using your grandma's birthday money, this is something that I did have quite a little bit of an investment in, and to have the model built up properly now, it just makes it feel all that much more special. On top of everything else, I also want to say, if you got to this point in the video, congratulations. It's great that I'm able to keep your attention for this long period of time. And in terms of YouTube videos, with the length of this video here, that is something that is really out of the norm. Most YouTube videos tend to be shorter in duration. So if you got to this point in the video, it's probably perhaps, I keep you entertained, and you probably are watching this video and learning some new tips and techniques in order to incorporate with your own builds. Be it builds that you're doing for the first time around, or perhaps you might get the itch now to look into your collection and see perhaps there may be one or two builds that were just not built all that great the first time around, or possibly a model that just fell into a poor state of disrepair. It does happen. So if that is you, perhaps this gives you the incentive to, instead of throwing them into the garbage, perhaps you could go ahead and give them the elbow grease treatment, and you can turn that build into something that is actually very special and something that would be a nice thing to have prominently displayed in your collection. And with that, that wraps up this episode of Old Tank Repair. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being Old Tank Repair episodes like this one over here, my other small scale model showcase videos, as well as my larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been mentioned on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by the ECA Shapeways store, where we have more 1/35 scale and 1/48 scale 3D printed components to upgrade tank models, as well as don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.